Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this, the 24th meeting in 2013 of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. Can I welcome members, visitors and our witnesses, who I'll come to in a second. And I can remind everyone, please, to turn off all electronic devices, or at least turn them to silent, so they don't interfere with the recording equipment. Item 1 on the agenda today is our draft budget scrutiny, which is continuing. We have 2 evidence sessions this morning. We are joined firstly by a disparate panel, I think it's fair to say. Starting on the left, we have Fraser Kelly, who's Chief Executive of Social Enterprise Scotland, David Lonsdale, Assistant Director, CBI Scotland, Gordon McGuiness, who is Head of Industry Engagement and Employer Offer, Skills Development Scotland, Ruchir Shah, who's Policy Manager with SCVO, and Dave Watson, who's Scottish Organiser from UNISON Scotland. So welcome to you all. Now, I'm sure you will have seen John Swinney published his budget last Wednesday. I hope you've all had time to have a look at that. We also have your written submissions. In view of timescale, I think you've all indicated you don't want to make an opening statement, and that's very helpful. We've got about an hour and a half allocated to this, but we do have 5 members of the panel and members wanting to ask questions on a wide range of subjects. So I've asked members if they can, rather than just throw out an open question, which all of you will want to answer, if members can direct their questions at a particular panel member, that would be very helpful. And if any of you want to come in and respond to a question directed to somebody else, if you just catch my eye, I will try and bring you in as time allows. And if, both the members and witnesses, if we can keep the questions short and focused and to the point, and the answers as similarly focused and to the point and short, that would be very helpful in terms of getting through it in the time that permits. And I'd also remind members and also witnesses, we're here to scrutinise the Scottish Government's budget, and if we can stay focused on that rather than bring in other extraneous matters, that would be very helpful. Right, that said, I wonder if I could start, just to let you warm yourselves up, with a general question to each of you, which I'd like you to answer in no more than maybe a minute each, if you can. The purpose of our committee's scrutiny of the budget is to try and determine whether or not the government's budget meets its objectives and priorities. And in relation to this committee, what we're interested in is the government's overarching purpose of increasing sustainable economic growth, and tying that in relation to the National Performance Framework targets and indicators. Do you believe this budget does that? Does it help meet these, this overarching objective of government? Maybe start with you, Dave Watson, if I can. Sure.
I think, Convener, we do have to be realistic about what a Scottish budget can achieve in the very big issues in relation to the state of the economy, where we're possibly just coming out of the longest and deepest recession for several generations. The recovery is, as we said, nascent at best. I think where the Scottish Government budget, obviously we and others would argue for greater powers, but within the powers that currently exist, we'd like to see a focus certainly on creating employment. We'd like certainly to see what the Scottish Government and Parliament can do in relation to tackling the shift from wages and into profits and the incomes of the super rich, because we believe that by putting money in the pockets of the lower paid, that will drive the economy locally. There will be less leakage from that on that basis. I think we are concerned that some of the revenue cuts that are in there, certainly they are partially made up from capital, but we'd argue there is quite a lot of leakage from capital, whereas revenue put in the pockets of low-income earners would actually do much more for the economy on that basis. And we'd also like to see quite a big effort in relation to workforce skills. I think, as you might have seen, our largest private sector area is the energy industry, and you may have seen this morning some concern about skills in oil, and that is replicated in the power industry as well. I think that's probably a little longer than my normal tweet in the morning, but it's we're there.
Thank you very much. We'll just work our way along the panel. Ruchir, Shah.
Okay, I think for us, well, I guess, it's a very safe budget, I think it'd be fair to say, and it's largely a continuation of existing measures, existing allocations. Some reallocations within the budget. So we have got some issues with some of the reallocations which seem to be taken from underspend in order to make new announcements. But I think overall for us, some of the measures around tackling welfare are quite welcome, and there has been a recognition from the government, from the call from many voluntary organisations, that there needs to be more done to support our communities at a time of austerity. However, having said that, it does seem to be very much a patching up type budget. Some of the major changes that we would like to see in terms of refocusing the purpose of the government's budget slightly away from just growing the economy and economic growth and growing GDP and towards tackling inequalities. Some of that is not as evident as we would like to see. There is, however, some good signs in there. And if you look at the equality statement, for example, there is good recognition of some of the programs that are working quite well at a grassroots level in our communities. Community Job Scotland, for example, which brings together many voluntary organisations to play a role in supporting job outcomes. But I would say that, much of the budget is kind of a continuation of existing measures. We would not expect much different at this stage. We are in a pre-referendum year, but we would like to see some signs of shifts in how money is spent within the big budget items. This is not so much about how much is allocated at the big block level to the NHS and to the local authorities. So it is how money is spent within those that is absolutely critical. And we have got a number of bills coming through Parliament which can help shape some of that, which can put some flesh on the bones of the budget. The procurement bill, for example, the community empowerment bill is another example, and the health and care integration public bodies joint bill. This is where the real action can take place. So it's very difficult to look at a large budget and say, we're putting several billion more into this area, especially when it's very difficult to shift those budgets anyway from one to the other. There's very little room to maneuver. So the kind of money that is available to shift around tends to be a few million here and there. So on that basis, it's very difficult to see how you can actually radically change any kind of outcomes towards shifting towards inequalities, which is what we would like to see.
Gordon McGuiness.
Thank you. I think the budget, the indicative settlement we've had, we're pretty content with. I think it's an endorsement of our direction of travel. I think a collective effort across the public sector, we've made inroads into key priorities around youth employment, and I think that's to be welcomed. It offers opportunity for us to continue to work with and transform our services in the light of public sector reform. I think it's an endorsement, and a key part of my own role is around the development of strategies to support the industrial growth of the government's key sectors and other sectors that have a regional priority, and that's where we see increased investment in our activities, and we're getting good feedback and report, and we can maybe touch on some of the stuff that Dave mentioned in relation to our work across energy. So I think overall, I think it's an endorsement of the work that we've done. It allows us to continue the direction of travel with an increased focus on modern apprenticeships, and we're looking forward to working with the Wood Commission in terms of their next phase of working to the kind of post-16 and vocational review that they've undertaken. Obviously, the interim report last week made some recommendations which we're working with just now, but overall in terms of the budget, I think we're happy with the direction of travel.
David Lonsdale.
Thanks for the invitation to the convener, and thanks for the challenge of doing this in 1 minute. Yes, it's the third year of the 3-year spending review, and so I think it's reasonable to conclude that all the main spending decisions were taken at the outset, and that's right and proper. We wholeheartedly endorse the Scottish Government's objective and the premise of your question that the growth objective should be the priority of the budget. I think it's being realistic. I think it's in light of the uplift in NHS spending as a result of the protection that's been given to it, I think it's reasonable to conclude that's actually the spending priority of the 3 years of the spending review. That said, there were a number of useful measures announced in the budget on housing and infrastructure, for example. We think there were some missed opportunities to do with air connectivity and to do with business rates. As we said in our submission to the Finance Secretary, and we sent to the committee in advance of today's appearance, we think a bolder approach could have been taken to make some savings and then reinvest the money in areas such as infrastructure, export support, and skills development.
Thank you. Fraser Kelly.
Yep, thank you. all has been said previously in terms of the continuing pressure that exists on public service budgets, and whilst we are seeing the green shoots of recovery in terms of the wider economy, I suspect that the pressure that will be on public expenditure will continue for a number of years to come. So I think the budget does what it says in the tin in terms of the 2011 to 2014 programme. I suspect that our view is that we simply shouldn't view this as a redistribution of money. We should look at the additional levers that sit alongside the budget responsibilities. And that's around the design of services, and Ruchir mentioned a number of things. We're looking more around what will happen in co-production, what will happen in co-commissioning, what will happen in terms of public-social partnerships and the development of those, because we genuinely believe that social enterprise in its context delivers both to the economic imperative and to the social imperative. And I don't think that in terms of a budget settlement we should simply look at a redistribution of the monies to say that we should achieve one thing against another. So happy to continue the questioning further.
Okay, thank you, Fraser. Thank you to you all. There's a whole range of issues you've touched on, which I'm sure will come up in questioning. So we'll get straight onto that, and I'll bring in Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, gentlemen, and thank you all for your written submissions. One of the things that stood out for me was a submission by the CBI, and good morning, Mr. Lonsdale. You would like to see removal of ring fencing for the NHS. I mean, in doing that, how do you see that would impact on the budget? And basically, where would you take the money and how would you redistribute and to where?
Well, we're conscious that this is obviously a political decision. There aren't exactly many out there arguing that the ring fencing on health expenditure should come to an end. I think we've set out a reasonable position that says NHS is getting a third of total spend. It's had a very good run in recent years, particularly in relative to other areas of expenditure. By ring fencing health expenditure, that means it puts other areas of expenditure in a more difficult position than it otherwise would be. And so what we've said is that perhaps not this year, but at some point, some sort of signal has to be made that will come to an end. Otherwise, it's going to soak up an ever larger part of the budget. And I would suggest make it even more difficult for the Scottish Government to meet its growth objective at the end of the day. And that, we're told, is what the priority is, what should be, in our members' view. And therefore, I think it's just part of the reality. Can it go on forever? I think I noticed in Mr. Swinney's budget an indication that he expected that to continue at a UK level as well for the next 2 or 3 years. So we understand the difficulties and the challenges and the political imperative. But if we're serious about making sure that the budget is supporting the economy and growth, then that's one area we think needs to be tackled. At the end of the day, we put forward a number of suggestions for changing spending so that it can support the economy. And that's, in a sense, the elephant in the room. As I say, it's a third of the budget.
Would you not accept that, obviously, with a ring fencing the NHS budget, we're actually securing, I suppose, the health of the nation to some extent, in that there's going to be a growing need for health services, given that we've got a growing older population and many people are going in with multiple aspects of health issues. And therefore, it's maybe right and proper to ensure that you can ensure that the health service is there to meet the need of the population.
Clearly, it's a thorny issue that politicians and government have to grapple with. What we're not saying is, reining back the amount of money spent on the health service. We're saying it should be a huge, substantial part of the budget. It just doesn't make actual sense to ring fence that when we're saying the budget and the wider government's agenda should be supporting the growth of the economy. Elsewhere in our submission and in previous submissions on budgets and to the Christie Commission and the Independent Budget Review, we've put forward a number of suggestions for actually getting more out of health expenditure, capitalising on the expertise and economies of scale that the private sector could bring to health budgets as well.
Ruchir, Shah, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, sure. I think we have in the past as well also spoken out against the ring fencing of the NHS budget. And I think the reason we give is you can actually prioritise health outcomes, and that is not the same thing as ring fencing the NHS budget. And in fact, if you want to achieve kind of health outcomes, and there are many other important routes that you need to take into account as well. If you gave the example of our ageing population. investment in community transport can make a huge difference to health outcomes for older people. There's the social care budgets, there's the investment in community infrastructure. A lot of this takes place outside the NHS, but by ring-fencing the NHS budget, you can sometimes actually mitigate against health outcomes in certain circumstances, because everything is then focused on the clinical aspect rather than some of the social aspects of health outcomes. So we would support a view that looks towards de-ring fencing the health budget.
With the integration of the health and social care aspect, do you not accept then that there is a protection there for that integration, and some of the outcomes, and some that you mentioned there, are actually there and will be, there's more of an assurance that we'll be able to sort of meet those particular needs. And some of it would actually sort of move towards the preventative spend anyway. But with the integration, that gives, I would suggest, much more security in terms of the health of the nation.
I think part of the problem is that, as our Chief Executive at SCVO spoke yesterday at the Health and Sport Committee, the focus on the budget integration, the focus on budget protectionism that comes out from focusing too much on how public bodies might work together can sometimes not quite speak to the experience of the people actually using the services. And we have seen in the public bodies bill that the focus on the people that are using and are getting confused between services and getting lost between the system has taken less of a precedent than the actual focus on the public bodies working together. So the part of the problem here is that we can get, to some extent, some kind of protectionism of budgets, I think, when we focus too much on protecting budgets with a view to integrating health and care. Thank you for that.
Okay. Just before we move on, I want to go back and pick up on something David Lonsdale said in his opening comments about business rates. The Scottish Government's draft budget shows a projected increase, I think, of more than £400 million in business rates revenue over the next 2 years. Is that, in your view, is that a realistic projection? Is that fair? Is that welcome? Or do you have any concerns about it?
From our perspective, we think it's somewhat optimistic. And we've outlined a few of the reasons why we think that's the case. Obviously, the economy is still muted. There are some encouraging signs of growth, but it's still quite muted. Forecasts for the next couple of years aren't stellar. They are encouraging, but they're not stellar. We've seen some increases in business rates in the last year on firms with empty commercial premises. Obviously, the levy on larger retailers. Retailers make up just over a quarter of all rates income. So, is it possible to tap that well again? Question mark. And also, I noticed one of the positives out of the budget that we thought was the extension into 2015-16 of the rates discount for enterprise areas or enterprise zones. So, against that background, it seems somewhat challenging. There may be good reasons why that's the case. If it's about an optimistic assumption about growth, sounds very, very positive. We hope that comes to pass.
Okay, thank you for that. I think I'm going to bring in Margaret McDougall, who wants to ask some questions about fuel poverty.
Yes, thank you. It was really just to ask the panel what views they had on the effects that this budget would have on fuel poverty, given that, is it 40% of people who are in work are actually in poverty rather than fuel poverty. So, if UNISON...
First rule of Fraser convenership, you do not ask open questions to all 5 members of the panel.
Sorry, I'll point that to UNISON in the first place.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, clearly, fuel poverty, and obviously I know you're going to be hearing from Energy Action Scotland in your next section, and I'm sure Elizabeth will give you more detail on that basis. Our view is that the energy costs are clearly one of the biggest burdens on, particularly on the low paid. There is a big increase in fuel poverty, but it's a very large proportion of the income of those at the lower income levels of our society. So it is important. I think in there are three elements, as you probably understand, to fuel poverty. One of those obviously relates to benefits, which is obviously a reserved issue, and they're coming under enormous pressure. The second is where the Scottish Government does have levers, which is money focused on energy efficiency, and I think there are some positive elements of the budget that we would welcome in those areas, but we think much more could be done in that, not only to tackle fuel poverty, but also to, with the economic spin-off of that type of work has for skills in the economy more broadly. And the last and the biggie in recent years, of course, has been the increase in energy prices from particularly the big six suppliers. We're singularly unimpressed, I have to say, with the work by Ofgem and the initiatives to attempt to do something about that. They've been very weak over many years, haven't delivered on that basis. In our view, there needs to be a much more fundamental look at the way the energy retail industry in particular is structured and the way that we tackle price. The market, frankly, has not delivered the energy at the price that it could have done, and we need that type of comprehensive response.
If I could stray perhaps from fuel poverty to poverty, as I said in my opening question, that 40% of those in poverty are in work. So perhaps Ruchir Shah could give me an answer or his comments on what has been done and how this budget would help those who are actually in work, because obviously we have all these zero-hour contracts that are out there which are causing a lot of concern to the public. So if you could comment on that, please.
Yes, we have major issues with zero-hour contracts. In fact, even in our own sector, we do see some zero-hour contracts with some of our organisations, which is a real shame. And this is part of the procurement system within which our sector, many of our organisations have to become cheapest bidder in order to win contracts, so that they can meet their outcomes with some of the most vulnerable people that they support. And that sometimes means that they make compromises. Some of our organisations make compromises. Other organisations absolutely draw a red line and say, look, we will pay a living wage to our employees. So we do have a mixed bag in our own sector. It's a real problem. Just picking up on the fuel poverty point, because that's relevant here as well, you'll hear from Energy Action Scotland concerns which they've raised publicly with us as well, about how there's been some shifts within the budget away from fuel poverty budgets in order to feed into new announcements. You've seen the bedroom tax, 20 million for the first year, which has been announced, and you know, it begs the question: are we taking money away from fuel poverty, put it into bedroom tax? In which case, you know, where many people will find themselves in a zero-sum game situation. Some of our most lowest earners in society. So there are issues all around. I mean, many third sector organisations are now initiating various campaigns to try and push poverty further up the agenda. Particularly in response to the welfare changes, which have been hammering a lot of the most vulnerable people that our sector serves. This has to become the key issue in a whole range of arenas, including the debates on Scotland's future, I think.
Thank you. Could I continue sort of on, you mentioned procurement, and perhaps if I could ask Gordon McGuiness his views on the forthcoming procurement bill, and should there be something in there that would give more opportunity for local companies?
Margaret, bear in mind this is an evidence session on the Scottish Government's budget. And I prefer we had questions that were very much focused on the budget and what changes to the budget might be required.
Yes, well, the budget is directly affected by, you know, the economy is affected by the procurement bill, and certainly if we could just continue on the employment, is it Head of Industry and Engagement? So if you could give your views perhaps on what the budget could have included then to improve the opportunities for employers to offer better contracts to employees rather than zero-hour contracts.
Yeah. As far as I'm aware, obviously employability legislation is a reserved matter. I think the work we do in partnership with local employability partnerships, primarily with local authorities, but with many third sector organisations, seeks to put conditions around some of the working arrangements and contractual arrangements that are in place, particularly where wage subsidy programmes are in place. And obviously our own modern apprenticeship programme is employed status, and zero hours contracts wouldn't apply there. So I think from where we are, there's a kind of solid base to work on. I would make a kind of comment on where we're seeing an impact in terms of our employability fund and the work that we do with partners. And as people move from unemployment or being economically inactive into employment, we're anticipating further challenges in terms of their ability to comply with the conditionality around universal credits, the main benefit system. And that has an impact around disabilities, but even people undertaking a part-time job 16 hours a week will still be under fairly heavy conditionality in terms of seeking further work and permanent work. And I think that's something that will play out as the universal credit system is introduced in full, and it's one that we're looking at and working with partners to address, because I think it will have an impact on the individual as they have that transition from, as I said, inactivity into employment.
Fraser Kelly, I think you wanted to come in, but if you can try and keep your remarks focused on the budget, that would be very helpful.
Indeed, thank you, Chair. There is a relevance, however, in the sort of procurement reform bill to the budget. We made in our submission to Mr Swinney during the budget consultation about the opportunity to include the requirement to pay a living wage during the procurement process. That's something which, in terms of the competence test, I don't think he felt that there was legitimacy in doing, but it comes back to my original comments about not simply looking at where we distribute the money, but in terms of what other levers and what other instruments are available in terms of co-production, the design of services, and how they actually achieve the best economic and the best social outcomes. So I think there is a relevance in that territory to be discussed.
Okay, Marco Biaggi, I want to come in on the fuel poverty issue.
Yes, the call for evidence had a line in it stating that we would be grateful if submissions could highlight from what area any additional resources should be diverted. And I noticed in the UNISON submission there was a reference to the importance of boosting funding for fuel poverty, and there was a reference to funding could come from spending on expensive PPP PFI schemes. We're spending £3 billion over the next 3 years on PFI. It's quite eye-watering, but I wonder if you could expand on that comment and say whether there are routes there to secure additional funding for fuel poverty or anything else.
Yes, I mean, hardly comes as a shock of we've been a long-standing opponent of the money that's been wasted on PFI schemes. Though I do notice in the budget the Scottish Government does like to ring-fence old PFI projects but not put their new PFI projects in the same annex. I'm sure that's entirely coincidental. But in our view, clearly while we've learned the lessons, we're still wasting, in our view, an awful lot of money. I did notice David's attempt to return us to the 1970s in terms of privatising the NHS as well. And needless to say, we think that would be incredible. I was around at the time when that was happening in NHS. It was an unholy mess that we've just got out of, and returning to that would be a disaster. In terms of spending money, I think it is difficult in relation to, obviously, if you sign up to long-term contracts, and that's the fundamental problem with PFI in all its various forms. If you sign up to PFI, you're signing up to long-term budgets. Now, that doesn't mean, and it has been possible to renegotiate elements of those contracts. So I think in terms of there are always changes required, and I think you have to use some imaginative renegotiation to try and drive costs down and reduce. There's something like I wrote a paper called At What Cost, which highlights the additional cost of these types of schemes, and I think you can get some better value out of that. And I think we also highlighted some other areas of spending. Tomorrow we're going to be publishing some, and I'll send a copy to the clerk, of some work we've been doing on spending on consultancies. You're going to see that even in the current climate, that millions and millions of pounds have been spent by local authorities and others on external consultancies. And again, we question the value, and we give examples of that spending on that basis. So I think you can do a little bit. It's not entirely fixed. You can do some there, and anything that would free up and put some real money into the fuel poverty area, particularly into energy efficiency, I think would be money well spent.
Preempting your paper, could you just tell me which fields those consultants generally work in?
It's varied. Some consultancy is perfectly legitimate. You know, where, for example, you have special, for example, Glasgow City Council has got consultants to advise on the design of a velodrome. Now, in fairness, our members in architects departments, don't build velodromes every day, so you clearly get an expertise. But the whole range of other areas where, frankly, the big consultancy, the generic consultancies are getting millions of pounds of public sector money, and we've targeted sort of 10 of the biggest ones and asked where the money's going there. And you have to ask the question, why you can't, as areas like the improvement service, for example, has been focusing more on using the expertise that's already there in the public sector. Most of us who have dealt with these types of generic consultants would say to you, well, they come in, they pick your brains and they produce a report on the back of it. Or, as I've seen many times, here's one we produced earlier and we've just changed the title at the top of it. That happens as well. And it's money down the drain, and we need a rigorous look at why we're spending money in these very expensive areas.
Briefly, yeah.
Can you tell me what PFI projects this government's
the NDPB programme is a
not
PFI. It is. I'm sorry. It is a PFI scheme on that basis. It comes under the whole PPP framework, as does the partnership arrangements that have been developed in terms of the other schemes. That's a direct lift from the English PFI lift programme down south. It's virtually unchanged. They are PFI schemes. They're better PFI schemes, I agree, but they're still PFI schemes.
Right. Okay. We're not going to resolve that debate this morning. Now, Mark MacDonald, do you want to come in on the fuel poverty issue?
Well, it was after the question had sort of slightly expanded beyond just fuel poverty, so it depends whether or not you're
right. Well, I'm not sure because I'm not sure if Hanzala wants to come in on fuel poverty.
Another question.
No, another question. Right. Okay. Well. If nobody else has got a question on fuel poverty, I'm happy then to go to Mark.
Thank you, Convener. It was when the question widened slightly, and it was to look at the wider inequality agenda that Ruchir Shah was bringing in there. And I think linking back to the comments that Dennis Robertson was making, one of the reasons why health spending is important is to deal with some of the inequalities that are created, but the root cause, as Professor Harry Burns has noted, of health inequality is income inequality. With that in mind, and perhaps I'll direct this to Ruchir Shah initially, does SCDO welcome the emphasis on the living wage that the Scottish Government is pressing, and do you feel that there is more that could be done outside of the public sector in this regard?
Absolutely. I mean, we fully welcome the living wage, and we would want it to be the standard by which all sectors pay their staff. There are, of course, some niggling issues that would need to be ironed out, particularly in the case of how procurement is managed by local authorities. And quite often you find many of our voluntary organisations are subsidising contracts. And how do they subsidise that? They have to cut various costs, cut corners. Now, we need to find a resolution to that. But the principal living wage is fully accepted by a whole range of our members, and we would fully support that.
I'll direct the same question to David Lonsdale from the private sector angle, and perhaps also ask what CBI Scotland and its members are bringing to the table in terms of addressing income inequality and in-work poverty.
Thank you for that question. Certainly from our perspective, we wholly support individual employers doing the best they can, and if they can afford to implement a living wage, like the Scottish Government has done, then so be it. But that's one ought to be for, we suggest, for individual employers. And we've been supporters of the national minimum wage. And if politicians want to put that to one side or either increase the rate or scrap it and move to a living wage, they should be upfront about that and tell us that's what they want to do and introduce the necessary legislation. So companies on the whole, the vast majority of companies recognise the importance of attracting and retaining good people, and the vast majority of employers pay people a good rate. Yes, we all complain from time to time about the amount we get, and there are people who are earning less, but I would say the vast majority of employers want to do the right thing by their staff, and they appreciate that as important for their reputation and, as I say, for attracting staff.
Okay. I appreciate the point that you make. Of course, obviously, legislation on the minimum wage is a reserved matter, and therefore the Scottish Government is doing what it can within the powers that exist under devolution. Is it your position then that we will continue to see a situation where, for example, we have people who rely on in-work benefits, for example, in order to sustain living standards, rather than having a wider living wage implemented, unless it is legislated on, and that there is not a shift from private sector employers to look at the wages that are being paid to their staff and see whether or not they are living wage, as it were?
Well, rooting it back to the budget, if I may, I think one of the strengths of the budget has been the council tax freeze, and I think that has helped a number of people who are looking, as we touched on earlier on, about the cost of living has spiked over recent years for a variety of reasons to do with commodity prices, inflation, and so on. So I think that's one of the benefits, and we've supported that. Perhaps for another reason to do with the alternatives and employers having to pick up any administrative costs for doing that. But our members tend to be companies who are good employers, want to participate in things like that. As I say, if politicians want to change law, increase the national minimum wage, should be upfront about doing that. Employers will respond and accordingly and pay wages that they have to. As I say, the vast majority want to pay good wages and attract good people and retain good people, and that's a premium at the moment. And you've got Gordon here from Skills Development Scotland, who's got a budget somewhere in the region of £200 million to try and create some progress in this area, and we've been very supportive of that.
Just out of curiosity, what would CBI Scotland's position be if a government, either at Westminster or in Scotland, if the powers existed, suggested changing the national minimum wage to a higher rate?
Well, we've been supportive of the increases in the national minimum wage in recent years. We support the work of the Low Pay Commission. I think it does a good job in balancing the demands for higher wage rates with the needs of the broader needs of the economy. So we've been very supportive of that. I'm conscious there are, 4 different rates of the national minimum wage. I'm not sure whether those would continue on the other side of independence, but we've been very supportive of that.
Okay. Just to direct another question to Ruchir Shah, because I was quite interested at the point that was raised about the money that's been set aside for bedroom tax mitigation. Listening to the statement last week, I think the Cabinet Secretary was clear that these were underspends created due to delays in energy efficiency schemes, as well as underspends within his own portfolio. But I wonder if the point that you made, leaving aside whether or not I would agree with it entirely in its accuracy, about shifting money from budget X to budget Y, essentially highlights the weakness of the devolution settlement, that we are dealing with a fixed budget, and therefore where mitigation measures are required, it is simply the case that money has to be shifted from one budget to another. With that in mind, do you believe that the money should come from a different source, or do you agree with the position that I'm highlighting, that the weakness of the settlement is that the Cabinet Secretary only ever has a fixed amount of money available to play with?
Okay, I think there's a question in there. So the point I'll make is last year, a number of leading organisations in the third sector came together. We were involved to look at the Scottish Government's settlement, the block grant, and to see if we were to make the decisions about how we would spend all of this money and carve it up, what would we do so that we could, because quite often you have organisations like coming and saying, give us a little bit more of this money, give us a little bit more money. But if we had to look at the whole budget, how would we spend it? And we very quickly realised that for political reasons, for economic reasons, and for many other reasons, there's very, very little room to manoeuvre in the budget that is available to the government. And therefore, what we see day in, day out is small announcements of a few million here, a few million there. And that is just not going to make any difference. What we really need to do, therefore, is to focus maybe a little bit less on the full blocks whether it's the NHS or local authorities, so on, and look within these blocks about how we spend that money. And that's why, as echoing the point made by Fraser, it is crucial that we use the other levers, such as the bills going in front of Parliament. The procurement bill, for example, is an excellent example. Could we put stipulations in the procurement bill for social, environmental impact and local community impact when the government uses this £9 billion procurement bill to seek change? These are the kinds of discussions that will have a huge impact on how the budget gets to outcomes. And so I think, we can only go so far in talking about allocations here and allocations there. Yes, of course, we do need to focus on whether some money is taken away from fuel poverty budgets in order to fund bedroom tax budgets and other budgets. I'm sure you'll hear more about this from Energy Action Scotland later on. But I think the key principle here is we do need to maybe expand our view a bit more. I realise there's a limitation right now in the current discussion we're having in this roundtable, but I think that's what my response would be.
Often when the budgets are allocated to organisations, then obviously the decisions on how those budgets are then used are often ones for those organisations to make, particularly, for example, local government, where a huge amount of the ring fencing that previously existed has been removed. Now, I'm not sure you were necessarily arguing that we go back to the days of heavily ring-fenced budgets where councils or other organisations are told this is the money and this is what you absolutely must spend this money on, you must spend X amount on this. Do you see the outcomes agenda as being the way to focus the spending rather than maybe the ring-fencing agenda that was previously used?
I think the current administration is looking at ways in which we can add stipulations to various contracts and procurement contracts. We've seen the same thing happen with NPDs, and we're now seeing it through the various social impact clauses. I'm sure Fraser will be able to add to that as well. So no, I wouldn't agree that this is about going back to ring-fencing budgets and having very detailed lists of hundreds of targets about how it should be spent or the money will not be given. I think this is about putting basic stipulations around things like the living wage, around job outcomes in the area, about social responsibility for those that are bidding for the contracts. And I think there's a lot more that can be done around that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I think on the same area of inequality, I'm going to bring in Alison Johnson.
Convener. The SCVO, in your paper, Mr. Shah, you said that you were concerned that the National Performance Framework, there were no indicators that measure changes in economic and societal inequalities across regions and individuals. And while we might increase growth, it's not to say that it was going to address inequality in any way. Some people might be experiencing boom and others may be in really dire straits. And UNISON too raised concerns about this focus on sustainable economic growth. A few months ago, the committee heard from Joseph Stiglitz, the renowned Nobel Prize-winning economist, and he suggested that we might more usefully measure median household income, just to get an idea of how your average family was doing. Do you think that such a measure would enable us to better direct the budget to have more positive outcomes for more people?
I have a huge deal of respect for Professor Stiglitz and his suggestions. Again, measures in themselves, if you shift a measure to median income, that may take you only so far. I think we do need to kind of think a bit more broadly about how we co-produce some of the measures themselves with a wider set of society. In the submission we made to the committee on this budget, we did propose that maybe the National Performance Framework needs to take a slightly different approach. Maybe we need to look at how government takes a lead role in setting national outcomes with society, rather than setting national outcomes and then asking society to vote for it, whether it comes in power or not, or to state that this is what the national outcomes are. If you bring society with you, if you get everybody to give their shared vision of what the national outcomes are, then we can construct indicators that meet everyone's need, that meet a shared consensus for the kind of society that we want to see. And I think within that context, Stiglitz's propositions for medium income could be one indicator, but it wouldn't be enough of itself, I think, to address the kind of principles that Stiglitz wants to see.
Yeah. I mean, I think
We've said also in our evidence that I think we pointed to obviously to the Oxfam work on the Humankind Index, and the Carnegie Trust have done some very good work in relation to this area. We think National Performance Framework, I agree, Ruchir, has to be a broader document. I think the medium household income is one useful additional. I agree with Professor Stiglitz on that. I think too much focusing on GDP, and GDP, of course, covers an awful lot of expenditure and income in Scotland. Doesn't necessarily reflect how real people on the ground are, because we have such an unequal society, with the richest in Scotland being 273 times more wealthy than the poorest. Therefore, GDP, frankly, loses a lot in the averaging. So, on that basis, I think the National Performance Framework could use some of these wider definitions, and I'd certainly recommend the Carnegie Trust work and their evidence on this point to you.
Ask another question. UNISON, as well as Stop Climate Chaos, have called for a doubling up to 40 million of the active travel budget. And obviously we know that local infrastructure projects can deliver a great deal, many more local jobs. I'd just like to discuss how we might use the budget to make this possible. And I think it also applies to Mr. Shah's comments. You spoke about prioritising health outcomes. So we can take budget decisions that do prioritise health outcomes. You know, only 2% of our transport budget is used to encourage walking and cycling. And Mr. Lonsdale was also suggesting that we might look at the health budget. But this is a real opportunity to improve the nation's health, perhaps save some spending on the health budget if we have a more active, healthy population. How might we ensure that such health outcomes are prioritised and do have an impact on the budget?
If I could suggest, I think that there is a tendency, and obviously I was an expert advisor to the Christie Commission, so I'd point you to some of the recommendations there, which are perhaps not as broadly followed. And the key thing for us was that when you look at the big difficult decisions, there's far too much silo planning in, and this is not just true for organisations, which is where everyone picks up from the Christie Commission report, but it's also true in budgets. And I think health inequality is a very good one. If Harry Burns has rightly pointed out, this is probably Scotland's greatest problem, the inequality in health. But it's not just a matter for the health budget. Inequality in health requires us to focus on housing, on fuel poverty, on environmental sustainability, the transport budgets, and everything else. So if we could start to look at some of these big issues in a much more cross-cutting way across the budgets, and I think we might get some added value. I think then you could have the sort of discussion that David and others have been focusing on in relation to the health budget, if we actually put the focus on understanding that the biggest things in health are probably not the NHS, it's about other areas than that. I think the transport budget has been the most difficult one for successive governments to address in relation to the climate change areas. There's always a demand for new roads and everything else, but we really do need to start to make some of the shifts to recognise that climate change is not just about the energy industry, it's not just about energy efficiency, it's also about the transport budget, and if we don't start to make some shifts in that area, we've certainly got very little chance of meeting our very ambitious climate change targets.
Mr. Shah, would you like to comment on that?
I don't know how much time we have, but I would agree with Dave. Do you want me to expand? I would. Oh, well, I won't unless you want me to, because I'm conscious that I've been speaking.
Yeah, well, that's fine.
Yeah. Very aware that a lot of Scots do not have access to a private vehicle. Most of our transport spend is going into, high carbon infrastructure projects, and they are largely designed to those who have cars. There is a massive percentage of Scots who don't have a car, but there are a great deal many Scots who'd like to, enjoy safe walking and safe cycling. I think this is a transport justice issue, and the community transport issue is one that we need to tackle very quickly.
There's some evidence to back that up. So, I mean, the Oxfam carried out their Humankind Index project last year, which they've been very successfully, reaching some of the communities which other research rarely reaches. And top amongst that was safety, being able to enjoy their environment around them, and to be able to, have a safe community in which they could get to work and back. And I think if you add to that the health outcomes that can be gained from sustainable transport, then yes, I would completely agree. I think that has to be one of the priorities. And it's another way in which we can get to health outcomes, which doesn't have to mean building new hospitals or maintaining new hospitals.
Okay.
No?
I would be declaring an interest as a very enthusiastic cyclist and an exemplar of demonstrating the benefits, because I've lost a lot of weight over the last 2 or 3 years from taking up cycling in quite a major way, and doing a few events in the convener's constituency as well. But clearly, from going back to the reason I'm here, a bolder approach to making savings in the budget would free up monies for opportunities like that. But that might be a personal calling as opposed to one that CBI would necessarily advance.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mark Roberge, I think, wanted to come in on active travel.
Yes, the issue of where the money comes from is any time there's a major spending commitment, the big one, or a call for a major spending commitment. Mr. Shah, you seem to be suggesting that we should perhaps find the money from the health budget. Am I reading you right there, or is it just that there's no obvious place to take the money from for an additional top-up to active travel?
As I said, when we carried out the exercise and looked at the budget, the main priority for us was how we spent the existing money. So you can create active travel initiatives through the health budget, or you could try and de-ring fence the health budget and bring some resources in other ways. There are clearly political reasons either way, which the government needs to take into account, and we understand that. But I think it's the outcomes that we want to get to, and I think more critically, it's if you want to get to these outcomes, you need to bring people with you, and you need to get the views of others with you. And the points that Fraser made earlier about co-production and co-producing the budget is quite critical. We've been calling for quite some time now that the budget itself should be a co-produced effort. There's no reason why the government just has to sit in a back room and decide how it's going to construct the budget. It can be co-produced. It can be more consensual.
I'm not sure that answered the question, but I'll move on. Mr. Watson, the UNISON submission suggested that the funding could come from other areas of the transport budget. Can I ask which other areas of the transport budget?
Well, I think one area I do think we would look at roads. I think you do need to make a decision at some stage to look at a shift from roads into more active travel. I think if we're serious about climate, it's not politically easy, and I wouldn't have your job in terms of making those types of decisions. But if we're serious about making a shift from one type of transport to another, then you do need to look at it. But my big point would be that you actually, if you don't look at everything in the silo, you can then start to open up discussion. So I wouldn't say, let's go around picking from this and that, because I think what I would say is that you start to look at achieving some overall objectives, be they health inequalities, climate change and others. And I think that means you start to look at the budget in a very different way and not limited to the current silos. But if you're asking me within the current budget arrangement, then I think that's one of the areas that we would look to make a modest shift. It would be modest because the money for active travel is very small. Yeah.
So, in terms of the budget, it would be from motorways and trunk roads, and the budget lines within that, which I have to admit, looking at the document, are slightly opaque, that are aligned to new road building. Thank you.
I should say for the official report, Mr. Watson nodded at that point. Okay, Dennis Robertson's got a brief supplementary on this.
Yeah, basically, I'd probably direct to Mr. Watson. Would you accept that there's a huge difference between urban and rural in terms of active travel? Because people in remote and rural communities probably are more reliant on maybe taking cars or perhaps other transport to get to their workplaces, whereas maybe in the urban areas it's maybe slightly different. So the one size doesn't fit all.
I'd entirely accept that. I think we have to have a properly integrated transport strategy which meets the disparate needs of Scotland's geography.
Except then that the budget that the Cabinet Secretary has put forward tries to attempt to look at the integrated transport aspect, and although there's a limited amount of money going into active travel, the proportions are probably about right in terms of looking at the urban and rural diversity?
These are difficult balances. I think we would argue that there needs to be a shift, essentially, that we need to put more effort into public transport and active transport if we're going to meet our climate change targets and address that. But I entirely accept that where you spend that money, you might be able to do more in public transport and in terms of active travel in urban areas than you could realistically in rural areas. That would be a perfectly reasonable point, yeah.
Okay, I'll bring in Chick Brodie.
Good morning. I wonder if I may ask Mr Lonsdale and Mr Watson, given the comment that Mr Shah made about there's little room for manoeuvre, and we know what that means in terms of the block grant, do you think the budget's balance between consumption and investment is correct?
No. No, and that's the point of our submission. Yeah.
Can you expand on what you think is delinquent, which area?
Well, I mean, what we've traditionally called for is, a greater spend on investment in infrastructure. And obviously, we keep coming back to this, thorny sort of issues for politicians to grapple with. We have, through the good times, if you like, spent a lot on various free services, and we all benefit from those. But it's tricky when there's less money around to do what you want to do. And if the growth objective is the top priority and that it should be reflected in the budget, then we need to try and address these things. We've set out in our submission a few months ago to Mr Swinney and provided to the committee a number of areas where we think savings could be made in the budget. And one of those, for example, to do with graduate contribution and things like that. So we think there needs to be a shift, as you say, as you would describe it, from consumption to investment.
Mr Watson?
No, I don't agree. I think there is a shift. I think if we're looking at the revenue budgets over the coming years, we've got 2 tight years and then 1 very, very bad year in terms of revenue cuts. I think, as I said earlier, one of the problems with capital expenditure, worthy though it is, and clearly it's right that we should put some money there, is that there is very great leakages out of that money from the Scottish economy. Some of the big capital projects bring in workforce from outside Scotland. There is some of the profits, etc., go to companies out with Scotland, in fact, out with the UK. Forth Road Bridge, Chinese steel is probably the biggest one, but there's many others on that basis. That's what happens with capital money. Now, revenue spending, on the other hand, if it's properly targeted and does go to those who are at the lower end of the income scale, they spend that in the locality, spend it in the local shops, they spend it in those particular areas. So I think revenue expenditure is still very, very important. And at a time when the economy is recovering, it's that lack of revenue spending, that lack of confidence in the high street, which is going to drag this recession out even longer than it's currently been.
I'll just ask you, what do you think the multiplier effect is of capital spending versus revenue spending?
Well, there are the classic multipliers 2.5, 2.7 that is on that basis, but there's still, that doesn't take account of leakage. And we think that revenue spending is very important and that you get that spending at the local level.
In UK terms, and certainly as best we can discern within Scottish terms, there is leakage on consumption expenditure because if you look at the balance of payments, the amount of consumption of imported products is probably higher than it should be.
In the broader economy, I'm talking about the government spending budget, and if you focus the government spending budget and revenue spend on the income levels of the lowest base, while the living wage, dealing with zero contracts, and those things are very, very important. And they have a real benefit on that basis because people spend locally, and then that helps the private sector in terms of driving the economy.
If I can ask on that basis, and I ask both of you again, why do you want to increase council tax in the current austerity situation? You think it's economically damaging. And Mr Lonsdale, you think council tax, it was right to freeze it and should continue at least for the foreseeable future?
Your earlier point, our figures in terms of the economic benefit from investment in infrastructure and construction is actually slightly higher, more towards £3 for every pound that's spent on it, and obviously that has a knock-on benefit for the wider manufacturing and supply chain. Yes, we have been a vocal supporter of the Scottish Government's council tax freeze over recent years, and the sort of fundamental reason for that was because obviously there was a previous suggestion that a local income tax would be brought in. That would be for, you know, at the time it was suggested that would be for employers to administer as opposed to us as individuals, and therefore that would have had a cost for employers. So that was something we didn't support. The council tax did rise exponentially. It has been frozen. I think it's a much more reasonable sum. If, you know, in subsequent budgets, the Scottish Government decided that it wanted to allow the council tax to rise, perhaps in line with inflation, I think would be much less of an issue nowadays, thanks to the freeze that we've enjoyed the last few years.
Shock horror that UNISON and the CPI agree on the issue of the local income tax, but probably stop at that stage before my career goes to go down the pan. In relation to the council tax, our argument is that nobody likes paying tax. Everyone likes a tax freeze, and and clearly our members like it as much as anybody else does. But the issue for us is how you spend that money, and we feel the council tax freeze is largely regressive. It puts more money into the pockets of those in the biggest houses who pay the most council tax. They get the most out of it in cash terms, and we think that's therefore a poor way of using a regressive tax cut. Is not a good use of public money in the current climate.
Before you move on, I think Marco Biaggi wanted to come in with a supplementary on capital investment.
Yes, on leakage in particular.
Yeah. Maybe I'll come back to you, Chair.
Do you have, do either CBI or UNISON have any figures on leakage for revenue expenditure? Because it's very easy to paint the picture of people shopping in local shops, but if they go to a supermarket, buy things that are imported, you're talking about just as much leakage as in capital investment, if not more.
I've seen various academic work done on, but they are very broad estimates, and they're available as anybody else. It is very difficult to pin down that basis. The work that I've seen would certainly argue that the low pay do tend to spend more in the local shops, in the local community, and that does help drive the confidence, which I think is one of the issues that's been missing in the current economic downturn. But in terms of there are, as far as I'm aware, I'm open to be corrected, but I've not seen any precise work, in fact, on neither capital or revenue in terms of putting that out. Yeah.
So you don't have sources you can cite either way around.
No, I'd accept that. That's our view of it. There are academic papers, but they're not going to give you the sort of hard numbers that I think you're looking for. They're judgments and assumptions that have been made by academic work in this area.
Aware of us having any detail on that, but the other point I would make in terms of infrastructure, construction, expenditure, it builds the long-term economic capacity of the nation, can reduce the amount that therefore is spent on maintenance bills going forward, improve congestion and so on. So I think there are longer-term benefits as well as the short-term here and now. Right. Alison Johnson, you've got a question on leakage?
Yeah, it's the capital investment question, really. I mean, the government has decided that in order to, their choice to fight the way out of the austerity situation we find ourselves in is to invest in construction projects. Now, employment in construction projects is massively gender segregated, and Gordon McGuiness, in your submission, you speak about the gap between the uptake of modern apprenticeships with young women and men is closing, and that's very much to be welcomed. So in terms of numbers, we're seeing an increase in young women taking up apprenticeships, but it is the case that within the most popular modern apprenticeships, there's still massive gender segregation. We're still seeing lots of young men going into construction, we're still seeing lots of young women going into childcare and hairdressing and beauty. So, we're more likely to see a young woman cutting the hair of the young chap who's involved in the construction project, and that obviously has an effect on their wages, on their pension prospects and so on. And I just wondered what, you speak about close the gap and various initiatives to make sure that young women realise what opportunities are there. Is there anything we could be doing with this budget to really address that? Because it's not getting, it's not it's not improving at a rate that any of us can be happy with.
It is improving, and it's a better picture than what it has been. I would make the observation that the gender segregation is a deep-rooted issue, and it probably starts in schools as young people move through their schooling and into education. So the decisions that are taken around subject and career choices are often influencing the future direction of travel, and that's why we're putting a great degree of emphasis into the work that we're doing through our career service, working with careers guidance teachers in schools, and through My World of Work, the web environment we've created. We're trying to do much more to open up opportunities and to highlight the issues where females in particular can go into what have been traditionally male-oriented occupations. It's something that we'll continue to work at, both with ourselves and with partners. We've done a fair amount of work with our training organisations, and in particular in terms of construction, with construction skills and CITB. And it's just something that we genuinely need to keep working at and providing good quality role models, and perhaps think around some of the access programmes that we've undertaken previously to maybe create environments that promote a bit more self-confidence and access routes into industry. But I'll come back and say that the modern apprenticeship programmes, each young person is employed by an employer. It's the employer that's making the decision. Our role is one of influencing both employers, but also trying to raise career aspirations of young people and females in particular.
Okay, you need to come back into Chickbrillion in a second. Just before I do that, I want to ask one last question on the leakage issue. Maybe Dave Watson can help me with this. There have been suggestions in Dunfermline locally that as many as 400 Spanish workers are coming in to work on the Forth Bridge, living in temporary accommodation. Are you aware of that?
I'm not aware of that particular example, but obviously in some of our industries, as we don't represent people in the construction industry, but certainly in other industries, that there clearly has been a case of bringing workers in on that basis. And that's why I think workforce development and skills is absolutely crucial in developing those particular areas.
Sorry, Chick.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, in the submission from Social Enterprise, there's a suggestion that there should be a transition from, in some cases, small private businesses to social ownership, something which some of us might agree with. I wonder if you can, in the context of the budget, suggest how that might be done, in particular in reference to for example, the public procurement bill coming down the pike. Are the agencies funded sufficiently in the budget to allow this type of activity at least to be promoted, albeit as a start?
Thank you, Chick. I suspect that the response would be how we design the market and the infrastructure in terms of where those organisations are participating. We know that there are businesses that are trading ethically at the moment, but don't sit within the clear definition of a social enterprise, and we won't get into discussion on what that definition actually is this morning, because it would take us some time. But we do feel that there are opportunities within the budget, and I apologise if it comes back to the thing that I've mentioned previously. It is about the sort of co-production. It's about the design and the delivery of services, and where that design is undertaken. We believe that there's a role for the private sector, for the social enterprise sector, for the voluntary sector, for the public sector, all to be involved in that design of public services. I suspect that that's a moot point, because we've now seen, and I mentioned in the submission, the Glasgow mapping exercise. We've got 509 social enterprises operating in Glasgow. It's something close to £250 million is generated in turnover. It's got 13,500 employees, which is more than the food and drink industry, more than the creative industries. Yet these are areas where we perceive that we should be investing in more than in social enterprise. If we look at where those organisations are participating, and how they're involved in the delivery of public services, but also now in the delivery of services to the public. The public have a huge opportunity to play here in terms of the way they buy goods and services, buying them from ethical businesses and buying them from social enterprise. I believe that that's going to it will necessitate a change. It will actually drive a change in the way that businesses are constructed. I see there's a real opportunity for us through the budget process in terms of creating markets and opportunity for social enterprise to participate, that businesses will actually begin to see that that's a recognised and sensible route for them to pursue, not simply on the basis of that there's a Giza grant mentality that exists within the social enterprise sector. That is gone. That has been done and dusted for many years. This is about businesses that are trading, delivering goods and services at the right price, at the right quality, into the right markets. So for me, this is about creating market opportunity. Some of that, in terms of our members, many deliver in the public service arena. If we're looking at the integration of health and social care budgets, there's an argument amongst our members that would say, where is that integration undertaken, and where does that integration create the best market opportunity? So I think the budget has an opportunity to create those markets rather than simply to shift the resources around from one pot to another.
Thank you. Can I just, one last question to Mr. Kelly. We know that the size of the budgets that the enterprise agencies have. I wonder if you have considered, or if they've considered, the availability of, to complement the budget, the European funding that's available for small businesses, from which we've been excluded because we're not a member state. There are two agencies, however, that can represent us. And the COSME fund now stands at 2.3 billion euros. And again, it's because we're not a member state yet. We've been unable to fully access that. Do you believe that's something we should do to complement the budget of the enterprise agencies?
Absolutely, I think it is. And there's a challenge for us in terms of our access to structural funds, our petitioning of where that sits. And my earlier comments made reference to the fact that there are other levers which are available. I think that they're out with the financials of the budget. They are around European structural funds, they are around DWP commissioning, they're around framework contracts, all of things which I think Scottish Government has a legitimacy to be petitioning UK Government on, and I don't think we're doing enough of that at the moment. I think there is an opportunity with structural funds. Again, this comes back to where that commissioning process and who is in control of the structural funds exists. Our previous experience in social enterprise and across the voluntary sector is that that has been a difficult process. Some of that has changed and become more flexible over the years. We know that the programme values that are likely to exist between now and 2020, yes, we absolutely have to have greater access to it, and we have to have greater control in the design of how those services or those resources will be delivered.
Just on that, just very briefly. Last week we had, there are 330 different funding streams, and clearly the government contributes to these to support small businesses and social enterprises. I wonder if you would care to comment on that in terms of areas of spending that Mr. Lonsdale, reduced spending that Mr. Lonsdale referred to.
There are a significant number of routes to funding. Social Enterprise Scotland advocates strongly a differentiation between investment and funding. And we need to look at how those resources are structured. Some of them are very clearly about investment. They're about changing the way that business operates from the voluntary sector and the social enterprise sector. The resources that are available in the third sector budget are very, very much smaller than the resources that are available in the mainstream economic development budgets. We believe that there's a transition process required in terms of the organisations that are operating in the third sector as they transition towards that greater commitment and that greater contribution to the main economic development budgets in Scotland. I've mentioned in my submission that we believe that resources should be allocated to increase business start-up rates. It should be about encouraging business growth, but it should be about investing in our big players as well. And we see that there are organisations within social enterprise who are able to create high labour absorption, they are able to create jobs, they are able to create turnover, they are able to generate profits. The social outcome that's achieved with those profits is then it's the double win, it's the double bottom line. That's the thing that we think is most important about the way social enterprise operates. So yes, there are 330 different doors to knock. I think there's merit in having a number of different instruments and a number of different ways to tackle the problems that we have. Simply putting one door in front of everyone would make it much more difficult. I suspect, however, 330 could do with a bit of rationalisation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hans-Alan Malik.
Thank you, Convener, and welcome to the committee today. Mr. Kelly seems to have got off reasonably easy this morning, so just a couple of questions to you in regards to social enterprises. And I mean, it's a huge army of organisations working away, chipping away at the background. You made a very interesting comment in your submission that you see green shoots. Can you relate that to the budget and tell me how do you see the green shoots? Are you relating to previous budgets, or are you relating to the new budget that you feel is going to be helpful? And if so, how?
So in terms of my comments on green shoots, that's probably a recognition that the popular press has decided that the green shoots of recovery are evident, and we've stopped actually doing everything down and actually are a bit more positive about things. So within the budget, I haven't suggested that there are specific comments which suggest the green shoots of recovery. I mentioned earlier on, however, that as the economic situation recovers, the pressure on public finance, I think, is likely to exist for a period of time to come. And David mentioned a couple of tough years ahead and then one really tough year. I think that's absolutely relevant. I think that's a good analysis of where we are. Where we see the growth of activity in social enterprise is within the public service reform agenda, and it comes back to those comments about where integration resources, the decisions are made around those. We do have some challenges with local authorities in the way that they traditionally follow their procurement mechanisms. We've advocated strongly for a number of years that Procurement Contract Scotland should be the route that we go down. However, when you do that, you drive price competition, and when it's a price competition, it's a race to the bottom, because what happens is that we essentially take the quality out of the process and actually drive towards the price of the commodity. So our argument would be that we need to understand where that recovery is happening, how it's happening, who are the drivers of that recovery. And part of it is about public opinion. It's about people deciding to buy goods and services in a different way. It's about that design of services within the public service reform agenda and making sure that local authorities, statutory agencies, health boards, etc., understand that there isn't actually, in terms of the procurement reform bill and the community empowerment renewal bill, I don't actually think there's any need for additional legislation at the moment. I think those statutory agencies have the ability to procure in a different way from they are at the moment without that additional legislation. They either choose not to or they don't understand how to. So I think there's, again, other levers within the budget process which aren't simply about financial distribution.
Thank you, Chair. Just to come back on that, I mean, you spoke about Glasgow having 509 organisations. You were talking about 330 different avenues of funding and acquiring funding. I'm just trying to tie this down to the budget itself, because what I witness in Glasgow day in, day out is the shrinkage of these organisations. They're dropping dead on a daily basis. So what I'm wanting to try to find out is how is this budget going to support these organisations survive, let alone continue to die the way they are? And do you actually see anything in the budget that will help support these organisations or not?
Indeed, and I mentioned in my submission that things such as the Enterprise Ready Fund is a very welcome investment from Scottish Government. I suspect maybe Ruchir would want to respond on the voluntary sector impact of cuts, etc., and where those organisations are experiencing the most stress and the most pressure. In terms of social enterprise, it's a slightly different model. It is about trading services, it is about generating surpluses and then using those surpluses to achieve the social outcomes. So again, coming back to that investment versus consumption question, I believe, and Social Enterprise Scotland firmly believes, that investment in social enterprise, and again, I come back to that word investment rather than funding of, they are very clearly different things. Investment in social enterprise has the ability to achieve a double bottom line. Ruchir, I'm not sure if you want to respond on the voluntary sector side of things, or Hansel, if you want, Ruchir, to do that. I mean,
if this, I'm just trying to see the tie-up between the budget and what is the budget actually going to offer that's new, because at the moment we need something new. We need an injection. We need a drive to sustain what we've already got out there. And all I'm trying to figure out is the budget going to help do that or not? And if it doesn't, what do we need to do to try and ensure that we try and come up with that injection that's required out there?
Do it to a certain extent. Again, I come back to those other issues about where else it can be petitioned. We've recently been involved in the consultation on the social investment tax relief. We have some challenges around that in terms of how that will be positioned, what it's intended to do, what the relationship is between the investor and the investee, and whether it's to achieve the financial return for the investor or achieve the social outcome for the investee. So there are a number of ways for us to respond and to do things differently. Within the budget, again, shifting money from one pot to another, I don't think has that benefit, but using the other levers that the government has, I do.
I think it's worth just remembering that the allocations that are specifically for third sector organisations in the budget are very small. That you see this. We're talking about continuation of £23.5 million within the third sector budget, and there's some additional monies in some of the welfare budgets and in the regeneration budgets, the People and Communities Fund, for example. And so I think we need to recognise that if you put these 20, 30, £40 million up against the actual income of the sector. Now, the income of the sector has been is the latest figures say is about 4.5 billion per annum. So 20, 30, 40 million against that. You can see that there's only so much you can do with that amount of money. Now, these are very important resources because they are capacity building resources. For example, the Enterprise Ready Fund is an investment in capacity. It's an investment to help organisations get their operations as such that they can then win contracts and get more money and enter into markets. So that's really critical and important. There are lots of pressures on the voluntary sector, particularly through the welfare changes, and that combined with recession and austerity is driving up demand at a time when all resources coming to the sector on all fronts, whether it's through the investments they hold, whether it's through the trading they do, whether it's through the donations from the public, or whether it's through contracts and grants, are all being squeezed right now. So, there are a lot of pressures on the sector, but I think what we need to remind ourselves is that focusing too much on the specific measures within the budget is not where the real game is. The real game is through the big block money that's coming through the local authority budgets, through the NHS budgets, and that's where we really need to open up a recognition and understanding of the role that third sector organisations can play in meeting some of the outcomes that we're trying to seek here.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Mike McKenzie.
Thank you, Convener. My question is for Mr. Lonsdale, and given if you look at the budget in aggregate, the biggest effect is a transfer from resource to capital. Surely you would welcome that as a good thing for Scotland's economy and for Scotland's businesses?
Yes, we do.
Thank you. And just to touch on another part of the discussion we've been hearing this morning, do you agree that increasing our exports would be an important part of improving our economy?
Very tough question. Yes.
Yes. Good. Good. No,
I can tell you're about to lead me into a trap. Another question.
Well, the point I'm leading into is that I'm somewhat dismayed by the concern expressed this morning for this concept of leakage, because it seems to me that if we're going to increase our exports and improve our economy, we're not going to be able to do that if we put a trade border up and say that we're not going to accept any degree of imports, either of goods or labour from other countries, and that type of protectionist discussion always arises to an extent in times of economic difficulty. But would you agree with me that it's really quite unhealthy and misses the point?
Well, I think this country benefits from being open to competition from companies coming here, just so that companies from this country can go over and win business overseas. And actually, I think the independent figures suggest that this country is actually very good at winning business overseas, particularly in areas like construction and professional services. So I think we'd actually have more to lose from being a protectionist approach. And similarly, I think the same applies in terms of labour, immigrant labour. I think we benefit from people coming here to work, sometimes for short periods or to stay for longer periods. And I think it's, perhaps ourselves and others don't actually shout from the rooftops as often as we ought to about the benefits we get from being open to new people and new talent and the opportunities to win business overseas.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Watson's bursting to come in at this point.
Yeah, just for the avoidance of doubt, I'm not arguing for trade protection. The Corn Laws have had their day, frankly, and I'm not suggesting we return to them on that. But I'm simply pointing out that, yeah, and nor am I saying that capital spending is a bad thing. It's a very good thing, not least, you know, because we have lots of members tied up working in capital expenditure. It's a good thing. The question really is that sometimes it's forgotten that actually some of the big hits in the next few years are on revenue spending, and if you want to look for a real disgrace in terms of the impact on revenue spending, look at the care sector, look what's happening to the workforce in that sector. It's a real race to the bottom where people are being paid on the minimum wage. They're not even getting the minimum wage in some cases because they're not taking into account travelling time and other arrangements. That is a real disgrace, and that's driven by revenue cuts and the procurement issues that Fraser and Ruchir have also talked about. So all I'm saying is, you know, revenue is very important as well. Capital is important, but revenue is important as well, and it has a real impact on both the quality of life in Scotland and the way we drive our economy.
No, that's me.
Right, Thank you. The Manchester Liberal, Mike McKenzie, has had the final say. Right, view of the time. We're almost at the end of time. A couple of things to end on. I think Dennis had another question to SDS.
Yes, it's Skills Development Scotland. Good morning, Mr. McGuiness. But basically, you've got a very glowing submission in some respects, you know, and I think you're suggesting you're extremely good value for money, which is always welcomed as well, I think. But it's really maybe going back to the point that you were discussing with Alison Johnson. You're meeting most of your targets, which is commendable. But in the areas that you've probably got more work to do in terms of the black minority ethnic groups and disability and the gender alignment, are you suggesting that you need more resources and more money, or are you maybe suggesting that within your allocation of the budget that you realign some of that to ensure that the minority groups are getting a better hit?
I would always welcome more money, Mr. Robertson, but kind of recognise where we are in terms of. I thought you might say that. I think it's about us trying to get maximum leverage in these areas. Fraser touched on it earlier. We're looking at the next programme of European structural funds, and historically there's been significant amounts of funds spent in these areas to get greater equality into measures. So in addition to working with as many partners as we can to both learn from them, to influence, you know, we want to step up our efforts. We're doing a significant amount of work through the industry leadership groups, and there had been a criticism made that we hadn't fully reflected the quality impact assessments in terms of the work we've done around the industry investment plans. My own view is that's been more of a communication issue for us, and that we've taken that fairly seriously, and we'll continue to do further work in that area. So please don't take that we're complacent in any way in this area. We're going to be doing more work and developing the work that we've already put in place.
So you're looking at more partnership working and bringing in agencies like Opito, for instance, and within the skills sector, and trying to get them to maybe up their game with regard to gender imbalance and minority group employment?
Yeah, I mean, Opito being one of them, but within the energy sector, but we're working right across the government's key sectors. So we've done some interesting work around tourism, where we've recognised and through the industry bodies that there was a kind of glass ceiling for many female managers and supervisors to make the next step up, and I think it's some innovative programmes in that way, providing some additional leadership and management support that we can start to tackle issues in partnership with businesses, in partnership with some of the trade organisations.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. McGuiness, I've got a couple of questions just to close on SDS's budget. You said, I think at the very start, that you saw the budget allocation as a vote of confidence in the work of SDS. But when we look at the detail, you're actually getting a 3.6% real terms cut. Is that a vote of confidence?
I think in relation to where other organisations are and the pressures that are on us, we've made and will continue to make efficiency savings. So I think within certainly some of the discussions that colleagues had with officials, I think we are content with the funding that we've got. We've been successful in other areas in terms of trying to attract in some additional revenue resource from other government departments, and I think that's in the back of developing strong propositions with industry. So that's the kind of approach that we seek to take, as well as maximising the outputs from the allocations that we've got, develop propositions and partnerships, and try and attract in some additional investment.
Okay, hold on a second, Zala. But okay, that's interesting. I'm interested you mentioned efficiency savings, because on top of the top line cut, you're also a member, SDS is a member of the Strategic Forum, which is budgeted to find £40 million in efficiency savings this year and next year. Can I ask you, what is SDS's share of that 40 million, and how are you going to find that money?
I couldn't answer that just now in terms of a specific figure. That's something that we're taking forward in partnership. And some of those savings will come from collaborative work in terms of joint procurement and joint contracts. I couldn't give an accurate figure at this time. It's something that prepared to come back to yourself with a written submission, if that's
That would
okay.
be helpful. And for the previous year, I think the figure was 25 million. Do you know if SES was on target to meet its share of that 25 million?
I think we are, yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, if you can come back to us with further information, that would be helpful.
Thank you.
Right, in view of the clock, we'd better call it a day at that. Thank you very much to all the panel for coming along. Very helpful to get your input, and we'll have a short suspension to allow a changeover. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if we can reconvene, I'd like to welcome our second panel. We're joined by Elizabeth Gore, who's Deputy Director, Energy Action Scotland, Dr. Sam Gardner, who's Head of Policy at WWF Scotland, and Jenny Hogan, Director of Policy, Scottish Renewables. Welcome to you all. Before we get into questions, does anybody want to say anything briefly by way of an introductory statement? Yes, I mean, if you keep it brief, Jenny, that would be helpful.
Okay, I'll be as brief as I can. Just 4 quick points then. First of all, I just wanted to try and put the Scottish budget into some perspective for renewables. I'm sure you're all well aware that by far the biggest drivers and barriers facing the growth of renewables in Scotland are really at the hands of Whitehall and Westminster, in particular with electricity market reform and grid infrastructure and access costs. However, the Scottish budget is still, of course, very significant, and for us, the most important part of the Scottish budget is in terms of demonstrating leadership in renewables, supporting research, development and deployment, particularly of wave and tidal, and of course building the Scottish supply chain and the skills base, as well as creating a heat network in Scotland. So I think that's where we'd like to see the focus. It's clear to us that Scottish Government support for renewables in previous budgets has been paying off. We've seen that we've been meeting our purpose targets in Scotland in the core areas of interest to this committee in terms of sustainable economic growth and reducing carbon. And we're also on track to meet our targets, despite that there are a number of challenges in the way. Thirdly, I think the main point I'd be keen to make today is on heat. And one of the things we've said in our evidence is that we would really like to see an indicator, a national indicator, on growing renewable heat production in Scotland. We have one for electricity, and I think if we have one for heat, that would certainly help us ensure that we're increasing our budget in that area. And fourthly and lastly, to say that the draft Scottish budget that's been published now looks positive for renewables. We welcome the extension of the Renewable Energy Investment Fund in particular, and continued investment in the National Renewables Infrastructure Plan for ports and harbours. And I think the areas that it's targeting in terms of offshore wind, marine, heat and community projects is welcome for us. So again, I think I would focus mainly probably on heat, and that's the area we would like to see particular focus. Thanks.
Very much. Sam Gardner, do you want to say something briefly?
Yes, very briefly. Firstly, to thank the committee for inviting WWF to give evidence today. It's much appreciated. Really to draw on one of the conclusions of the committee's previous reports, which was that the budget has to give confidence that the Climate Change Act targets will be met. And that is the challenge that we set ourselves in looking at the budget and contrasting it with the RPP. So it's in that direction that I'll be keen to discuss further with committee members, and particularly looking at the housing sector and the degree of shortfall that we see there. And then the remaining point is really to recognise and welcome the efforts of the committee to integrate the National Performance Framework with its scrutiny of the budget. We very much support that endeavour and would be happy to discuss that as well with committee members.
Thank you. Elizabeth Gore.
Energy Action Scotland is grateful for the opportunity to give evidence to the committee today. We are focused on fuel poverty, and we recognise that fuel poverty can impact on a number of different policy areas, be it energy, energy efficiency, housing, but our focus is on people not being able to afford to heat their homes. So that really is the sort of bottom line in terms of Energy Action Scotland's focus.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, the areas all three of you have touched on, I think, will be ones of interest to the committee. Can I remind members if they can keep their questions short and to the point, and it would be helpful if members would address their questions to one witness rather than just throwing them open to all three. But if you want to come in to respond to a question to another witness, by all means, just catch my eye and I'll bring you in as best I can. And I can remind both members and witnesses we are here to take evidence on the Scottish Government's budget. So we have questions, please, as far as we can, relevant to that topic without bringing in other extraneous matters, given the time constraints that are in front of us. Could I maybe start off with a couple of questions? Picking up on Jenny Hogan's point about the renewable heat issue, the Audit Scotland report that came out last week was focused on this and the lack of progress being made towards meeting the heat target. Specifically looking at the Scottish Government's budget, What do you think is in the budget that helps, or what more would you have liked to have seen in the budget to try and progress this issue?
I think there's various funds that are aimed at tackling, and I'm sure my colleagues here will also touch on the ones that are particularly of interest to them. I mentioned the Renewable Energy Investment Fund, which has come from the fossil fuel levy, and that's been a very welcome chunk of money that has been targeted at marine and heat and communities. I think really for us, when it comes to the specifics, that's really what's going to be of most interest. So at the moment, we've seen the broad packages which will contribute to heat, such as reef, but we would now like to see what specific parts of those sectors, how much money is going to be targeted at each of those sectors. So I think that's the next level of detail that would be of interest to see.
Tom Gardner, do you want to come in
could
on
I
that?
possibly thank? So I think the focus on heat is welcome, and it's clear that the Scottish Government is giving greater focus to heat with the promise of a heat generation policy statement later this year. But the first thing that I find challenging is the granularity of the information in the budget challenges our understanding and ability to cross-reference it, for instance, to the ambitions of the LPP and the climate change target. And I know in previous years the Scottish Government has provided a breakdown of figures to level 4, where they've tried to put those to budget headings that correspond with the LPP. And that would help greatly in being able to have confidence in the level of funding is there to match the step change in renewable heat provision that we need to see in Scotland. Energy Saving Trust have calculated that we need something in the region of a 10-fold increase in the provision of renewable heat to properties in Scotland if we're to meet its ambitions of 100,000 homes to have renewable heat by 2020. So there is a significant step change in effort that's required, and information, level 4 figures would go some way to being able to give us some confidence whether or not that was there or not. The other point I'd just like to raise is that the District Heating Expert, or the Expert Commission on District Heating, made a number of recommendations to the Scottish Government that were responded to in a district heating action plan, and we welcome that action plan. It shows a commitment to supporting district heating, but it also, there was a number of recommendations about funding specifically to support district heating, which are not followed through in the action plan, particularly a request or a recommendation to increase the district heating loan fund beyond the £400,000 limit to encourage bigger projects to come forward. The provision of seed funding in order to get projects to a place where they have a business proposition. So there's an awful lot of analysis and assessment work that needs to be done in advance of a district heating network. And finally, and it may be that the Scotland's Future Trust is doing this, I'm just not aware of its conclusions, but to look into how the public sector can underwrite or support the infrastructure, the provision of larger than immediately necessary piping infrastructure. What we're seeing is where district heating often goes in, it's fitted to the number of properties that are initially connected to it. And that it's no longer future-proofed against the potential for further connections to be made to that, because the piping is of a scale that doesn't allow for that. And that's quite a challenging investment proposition to put in, to ask for someone to invest in a potentially what's regarded as a new technology in Scotland and the UK, but obviously is very common elsewhere in the world, which is buried assets. And there is a need for public sector involvement in that in order to try and provide confidence that we can have this long-term infrastructure in place that properties can connect to as and when they change their heating source.
Mr. Gore, do you want to add anything on that heat issue?
Colleagues on the panel have covered the wider issues, the bigger picture, but taking it down to sort of a more personal level, I think it's important that when we're looking at bringing new technologies into people's homes, that there is support for people in perhaps more limited circumstances economically, who maybe don't have the capital to spend on bringing new technologies into their home. And there are some funds to do that, but we also need to look at the promotion of those funds so that people know that they're there to be taken up, and that needs money. But also the support, information and advice as to how to operate the technologies, which system might be better for them as opposed to something else, what suits their circumstances, their house type, etc. And that sort of advice provision also needs funding.
I think that's an interesting point. We had an interesting debate in the chamber yesterday on the coal industry in Scotland. I think Mr Mackenzie was making the point about people in rural areas relying on coal fires for heating still, and how you try and encourage other sources of heating. Can I ask one more question? I've got other members who want to come in, but ask one more question, maybe to yourself, Elizabeth, first of all, if I may. In John Swinney's budget, he announced a £20 million fund to mitigate the under-occupancy levy being brought in by the DWP. Of that 20 million, half is coming from the 2013-14 Home Energy Efficiency Scheme. Do you have concerns about that?
For us, that was a very bittersweet announcement. On the one side, the funding is staying within what you could class as an anti-poverty programme, which was welcome. But on the other side, there was concern that there is indeed an underspend at all on the few poverty programmes, particularly when we're only halfway through the year. I understand, speaking to officials, since that announcement, that it has been a sort of system problem, if you could term it that way. The Scottish Government has redesigned its programmes this year in terms of supporting people in fuel poverty. And for the best of intentions, those were dovetailed with the programmes that the energy companies, the fuel utilities, have to deliver, specifically the energy companies' obligation. Now, we're in support of that. The Fuel Poverty Forum was in support of that, because it means you're not duplicating effort, you're not trying to chase the same people, you're making the best use of the funding available. However, there have been delays in any new programmes being set up, never mind two quite large programmes coming together from different sources, different governments. And the anecdotal evidence that we're receiving from people working in the field is that the energy company obligation in particular is quite onerous. The reporting is quite onerous. The evidence that householders have to give, proof of ownership, proof of benefits, etc., is quite onerous. So it has taken some time for the programmes to bed in. That said, I think it is still money lost to the fuel poverty programmes, and that is of concern. And we need to be absolutely sure, all of us need to be absolutely sure, that whatever teething problems there have been are not more serious than that, they're not endemic within the system, that they can be addressed. Understand that the underspend from this year from the HEAPS programme was also complemented by underspend from last year's energy efficiency programme coming to an end. So we would not like to see a pattern forming and that this underspend is carried forward. The Finance Secretary also, in his statement, announced that the fuel poverty budget for next year is going to increase, and that is welcome. But what I would put to the committee is that the headline budget at the start of a year is only part of the picture. We have to know that the money is being spent, how it's being spent, and has it been effective. And therefore, we need very good reporting, we need very good monitoring, more so than has been to date.
Okay, thanks for that. Sam Gardner, you wanted to?
Just a very quick addition to that, which I think touches on the total fund that's available for energy efficiency and fuel poverty, and the Cabinet Secretary described it as the £200 million annual budget, which is 79 from the public purse, and the rest to be levied in from the private sector. What I'm not sure we have is the information or the data to show that that ratio is being met. And I think it would be very welcome from our point of view as stakeholders, but also I suspect from the committee's point of view, to have annual reporting on that breakdown of public and private sector investment in our energy efficiency programmes.
Okay, thank you. I've got a couple of members who want to come in. I'll start with Chick Brody.
Thank you. Good morning. It was really just to follow on the question and the debate we had yesterday in terms of, and the point that Sam just made in terms of the leverage of private investment. When it relates to heat generation, I mean, in the east end of Glasgow, we're already using geothermal energy sources to heat some of the houses there. And given the warm water that flows through our disused coal mines and underneath the earth, have you any indication or have you any proposal that we might divert some of the allocated monies to the promotion of these heat sources?
I'm not. I wouldn't know. No, I wouldn't recommend diverting of existing funds from within certainly the pots that we are concerned about here today on energy efficiency or the Renewables Fund. I think there is a need to increase funding for renewable heat and particularly for the provision of district heating. In some instances, that's not necessarily significant sums of money. We're talking about the provision of advice, the provision of, say, template contracts, legal advice that gives comfort to businesses and local authorities who are going forward into what are potentially long-term arrangements over the procurement of heat for a number of years, that they can go forward with that, and that's a safe proposition for them. So there are steps that could be taken to remove some of the barriers. I think more fundamentally, we need to be looking at, is it a reasonable expectation to think that the private sector will come in and make the necessary investment for large-scale infrastructure provision of district heating when we're in the absence of any kind of, as far as I understand it, a regulatory framework that gives them comfort that they will have a market for that to go to. And if you can look at other examples around Europe where district heating is a prominent heat supply source, you'll find that in many instances it's been public sector infrastructure that's been put in place as a kind of core network, which has then provided a revenue stream to the public sector as private investors connect to that and take the heat to the actual individual properties. So it's in Copenhagen, there's a very crude concentric circle network going on, which is the bulk of which has been originally provided for by the state and is rented out to utilities for the provision of heat and for connection to individual properties. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in exploring how we put in place large district heating networks that go beyond the small number of properties that we've seen to date. I think the national planning framework has an important role to play in that, in signalling clear intention as to where district heating is appropriate. I think there's a role for the public sector in providing a presumption of connection because heat loads are critical in providing stability of revenue and diversity of tenure. So if we have large public sector properties that connect to district heating, that could be the tipping point between making something a viable proposition and not.
Just on that, in a hypothesis that today developers of renewable wind generate and distribute money through community benefits. Do you think it would be a good idea to put it into something like fuel discount schemes, which might apply to the heat generation schemes?
I'm happy to at least start on that anyway. Most of the community benefit schemes we've seen so far have been from onshore wind, that's correct. In fact, I think it's about £5 million per year we've seen from the community benefit register from that, so it's been a good contribution. I think one of the successes of it has been that there has been some flexibility for communities to have some choice on what they spend that money on. However, of course, I'm sure we would certainly agree that being able to use that money on things like energy efficiency would certainly be very welcome and very wise.
Buying football shirts for the local team.
The topic of the Scottish Government's budget, so we can try and stay focused on that.
What I'm getting at is there is a sum of money which could be complementary to the budget to achieve the objectives that we're talking about.
I wouldn't disagree with the fact that that's certainly a source of funding that could be used in that way, but I would be cautious of directing that money, because obviously communities need to have a say in what that money should be spent on.
Okay, thank you.
Mike McKenzie.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I was very interested in what Elizabeth Gore was saying in terms of, the the various fuel poverty measures from, dovetailing so that they work effectively. But would you agree with me that that's one of the real difficulties? It's not so much about the amount of money that we have allocated to the budget in any given year, or particularly this year, that because some of the schemes are relatively new, ECO, the energy company obligation, and also the Green Deal, that it's very, very difficult to anticipate at this stage where the Scottish Government might best put the money to complement these schemes, because they seem not to be working as well as perhaps they might. Is that a fair comment, do you think?
I think it is very laudable to have programmes working together, and that this is not new. It's not a new concept. It was the same idea with the previous energy assistance package. There was a sort of one-stop shop approach so that the consumer who wanted to have some advice and find out if they were eligible for grants could contact one point, and the work was done for them behind the scenes. The point about the funding is that we know what needs to be done to address fuel poverty. And the fact that it's an underspend is not an indication that there's not a problem. And it's not an indication that we don't know what the solution is, or that local authorities are unwilling to take up the funding. It's been a timing issue as much as anything. But for example, there are areas which are within the Scottish Government programme that could benefit from more funding, and that could be addressed with more funding. So there's a system that needs to be looked at and smoothed out, but more funding would actually increase the number of people being supported and taken out of fuel poverty in the longer term.
Yeah, but in terms of achieving maximum impact, more funding would always be better if we had a money tree. But in terms of achieving maximum impact with pretty scarce public resources, don't you agree that perhaps it may be wiser to wait and see how some of the UK initiatives, which I think you would agree with me are the major initiatives, how they're actually working on the ground, bearing in mind the previous experience with things like CESP and CERT and so on, and them failing to deliver. Isn't it a more prudent approach to see how the Green Deal, for instance, I'm sure you would agree with me that that's got off to a disappointing start, and it might not be the silver bullet of policies and may in fact be a dud. So in terms of us getting maximum benefit from slender resources, isn't the precautionary approach being followed by the Scottish Government perhaps the wise thing to do?
I don't think we can wait, and I don't think it would be wise to wait. The fuel poor can't wait for assistance, they need it now. If the Scottish Government is going to meet its targets, it can't wait, and I don't think it is waiting actually. The Scottish Government has put in place a number of incentives to bring energy companies, energy eco work as it's known, into Scotland. And we do have a lot of experience based on the previous programmes, and that needs to be brought to bear. Green Deal is and wasn't intended to be a programme for the fuel poor. It has a different purpose, and it's a private sector-led programme. ECO was brought in because it was recognised that vulnerable, hard-to-treat, off-gas-grid homes needed particular assistance. It does need the Green Deal to work, for ECO to work effectively, and I'm sure that's being addressed at the moment. But the general view is that they will need to work. There is no plan B.
The question to you then is, where best should the Scottish Government spend the resources to complement both the Green Deal and ECO? Because I think there is an overlap between Green Deal and ECO, in as much as I speak to lots of people trying to make projects work in a very complex funding situation, and that many of these district heating schemes, for instance, are barely viable, and you know, people are looking at really quite complex funding arrangements with crossover from Green Deal to Eco to the District Heating Loan Fund. And even at that, these projects can be very, very marginal. Where best should the Scottish Government apply its funding to unlock the potential and to make all these schemes work in a complementary fashion?
EAS was supportive of the move recommended by the Fuel Poverty Forum to have a sort of two-pronged approach. One is to deliver support on an area-based programme, so that local authorities who are perhaps best placed to know the condition of housing and levels of fuel poverty, areas of fuel poverty within their areas, could direct assistance at those areas first. And that programme is now rolling out. Meanwhile, Energy Action Scotland argued that there still needed to be a reactive scheme where individuals who are perhaps not living in those initially targeted areas could apply for help and get help because they need it now. And that was recognised, and that has been taken up by the Scottish Government under their Energy Assistance Scheme under HEAPS. And I understand that the promotion for that is just about to start, so we should start seeing the benefit of that over the coming year.
And if I could ask Jenny Hogan a couple of questions, Convener, and it's actually a kind of similar theme, because the difficulty, I think Jenny said in her opening statement that maybe you could confirm that the biggest effect in terms of us, the driver of renewables is really in Westminster policy, energy market reform, and a range of problems associated with that: grid connection charges, transmission charging, grid capacity, and so it seems to me there's a kind of common theme here that the Scottish Government can only do so much, and we'll have an impediment actually in the UK Government not moving ahead quickly enough in order to realise the opportunities of renewable energy. Is that a fair statement to make?
Well, I think it's certainly been reflected in the draft Scottish budget that the fact that the next year's budget's relatively low and the following year's budget's significantly higher, and as it's quite clearly stated in the budget, that's largely due to the delays and uncertainties that have arisen from particularly EMR. So yes, that, you know, it does certainly have a big impact, but as I said, there's certainly areas that the Scottish budget can still have an impact on the areas that I outlined: leadership, R&D and so on. I think as well as heat, and I agree with everything that Sam said earlier about district heating networks and the fact that the public sector really does have a big role to play in creating that infrastructure. We just can't leave that to the private sector. So that's a big area that the Scottish Government can make a difference in. Wave and tidal technologies and improving the R&D and helping those technologies to scale up. Absolutely a big role for us still to play there. And on offshore as well, and ensuring that we can build our supply chain. These are the areas that the Scottish Government can make a difference and is making a difference. And ports and harbours as well, I didn't mention, but the National Renewables Infrastructure Plan, it's taking time to see the private investment coming in there, but there is progress being made. And again, that's another important area that the Scottish Government can continue focusing on.
But in terms again of this maximum impact of slender public resources, given the investment hiatus we've seen as a result, I think, largely of energy market reform, don't you think the government's strategy within the budget is therefore a wise one, you know, and that hopefully energy market reform will hit the right levels in terms of strike prices, and that, you know, Scottish Government can supply the extra investment required to leverage in maximum advantage at the right time, but not prematurely when it may not have the desired effect?
Yeah, and I mean, that's basically what I'm saying, is that that's the correct approach. As I say, though, really the devil will be in the details. So how much, you know, the budget that's been set, how is that being split up between technologies? That's something that we'll be very interested to look at. And again, we need to ensure that there's a significant proportion of that going on heat. So that's what we'll be looking to see next. But certainly that approach, I think, is correct.
Thank you.
Sam, you want to come in?
So, quick point to go back to the funding levels for fuel poverty and energy efficiency. I think I'm right in that this is the first occasion that the committee has found itself in the position of having a final RPP and having a draft budget in front of it. All previous years, you've either had a draft RPP or a draft budget, and never of the two kind of sat next to each other. I'm not sure that necessarily makes your job any easier, I'm not sure, but it does highlight the RPP provides, and it's from its draft to its final conclusion, it did improve in its transparency, and it provides an indication of the total cost of policies and proposals, and then the grand total. Now, that isn't a cost that's just to the public sector, it's the total cost to deliver that package. But it's instructive to look at the step changes in funding that's needed across the coming years that are indicated in the RPP, be it for the homes and communities section, or indeed for the business, industry and public sector section, where there are significant increases in the cost of proposals. For instance, in 2013, there's a £24 million proposal expectation for homes and for business, industry and public sector. That leaps to 72 million in 2014, 91 million in 2015. Now, as I stress, that's not all beholden on the public sector, but we need to look for a fingerprint of that in the budget to see that reflected, that change. And we can't see that with the level of information that's provided in the draft budget, and maybe level 4 figures will give us some confidence. But there is a useful reference provided by the RPP as to the level of support that's needed if we're to have confidence in meeting our climate change targets, which is one of the things that we certainly want to see come out of this budget.
Thanks. I mean, we should get the level 4 figures on the 25th of this month, so that will be helpful in informing our discussions. Right, Ansal Malik.
Thank you, Convener, and welcome to the committee. Elizabeth has said a very important element of all of this was that there was no proper monitoring taking place, and I would like to agree with that. Now, I'm just wondering what sort of monitoring would be helpful. Would a quarterly report on monitoring be helpful, and if so, shall we take steps to try and put that in place so that we can in fact monitor more closely, because what we don't want to do is fall short again in our aspirations.
It's interesting that we're talking about timing and reporting, and timing is everything. Today, the Fuel Poverty Forum is meeting, and it is obviously taking on board the announcements that have been made recently, and I understand that the question of reporting and how the new schemes will be reported on is one of their agenda items. So perhaps I can come back to the committee with information on that at a later point. But in terms of the reporting to date, the Fuel Poverty Forum asked consistently for reporting of the previous schemes, and that wasn't really forthcoming. So I think what we need to have is information on the expenditure of the budget, but also to see what that is actually achieving. What are the outputs and what are the outcomes of that? Is it actually what scenarios are there in place at the start where you've got the headline budget figure? What could we expect to achieve in terms of physical measures, in terms of advice provision, in terms of the other add-on services that can be provided to help people out of fuel poverty, such as maximising income, giving tariff advice, or at least signposting to that sort of information. These all need to be part of a fuel poverty programme. So we need to have scenarios at the start of these sorts of outcomes that could be expected, and whether these have actually been met, as well as whether the budget's actually being spent.
Okay, just to follow on that, you've been reluctant to put a time frame on what period would be helpful, and I did specifically mention a quarterly report. So are you looking for more clarity in terms of, are you looking for more reports, more regular reports than a quarterly report? Or do you feel a quarterly report would in fact be sufficient to start off with?
I cannot see that anything longer than a quarterly report would be helpful. I think if you're going to take any sort of remedial action and look to report responsibly on the effectiveness of a programme, then it would need to be at least quarterly. I suppose I'm hesitating because I've earlier in this session said that the onerous reporting under ECO is one of the problems, but it's the detail of that. Having said that, ECO is reporting publicly and monthly already despite its difficulties, so we would like to see reporting starting on the Scottish Government programmes very soon.
I mean, I recall a report being brought to by the government, and I had asked the question that how frequently we would get the reports, and I was told, well, as and when there is change. But I feel, after listening to your evidence this morning, that in fact that it's absolutely imperative that we do get regular reports. And I was being very generous when I was suggesting a quarterly report. And this is why I had asked the question from yourselves, who are the experts in the field, if you felt that that was in fact generous enough, or you actually wanted more regular reports. As you suggested, there's going to be some discussion on this issue. You may want to come back to the subcommittee with other recommendations that might be helpful to us.
I tell the committee that the ECO programme is reporting, I believe it's monthly, and I think the intention under the old programme, the Scottish Government programme, was to report monthly. But as I say, I can bring forth, and I'm sure the committee can have access directly to the Fuel Poverty Forum's discussions today and what is being proposed to them and what they feel would be useful to them.
That'd be very helpful, Chair. Just another quick question on the same topic, if I... Thank you. In terms of reporting itself, I mean, reporting itself just simply tells us where we are at any given time. What I'm hoping that you'll be able to advise us on is that if we are falling behind, which we did last time round, what would your opinion be on how to fast-track issues so that we can play catch-up if at all possible? Because at the moment, not only are we wanting to deliver on the commitment that we've already made, but I'm looking at the previous failures to see how we can play catch-up if we can, because we do want to get there. So if we want to, and if we're serious about getting there, I'm sure the government would welcome any support and advice it can get. What would you suggest?
One suggestion that ES could make is that we as a charity, we're often at the interface between talking to people in government, talking to people in Parliament. We're also, we have advice agencies who come to us for information. We have companies working in the field. And very often we're the sort of the middle part of the communication line. And we have people from various parts of the fuel poverty field coming to us with sometimes anecdotal information, but it's an indication of where something's either working well or it's not working well. Now, the parts that are not working well you want to fix. The parts that are working well you want to do more of. So perhaps there could be, either informally or formally, some sort of feedback system into the programmes, which may or may not need to come through Energy Action Scotland, to say that maybe people working at the front line with customers, people who are taking calls and seeing a pattern forming, can feed back into the programme managers and say, this is something that needs to be looked at. You know, are other advisors, are other call centres finding this as well? And that way, perhaps, it shouldn't be viewed as criticism in a negative sense, that it's positive feedback and trying to improve the system. So that's maybe one way that could be used to improve as we're going along.
Yeah. Bring in Marco Biaggi, who's got a question on the same field.
I probably should know the answer to this already, but the eco-reporting, does that include a disaggregation for all the nations in the UK, or is it UK-wide?
That's a good question, actually, because ECO is an obligation across Great Britain, and there is no ring fencing for Scotland. Under the previous search programme, the Scottish Government had an informal agreement with the UK Government, with DEC primarily, to report on the expenditure across the companies in Scotland. We would hope very much that that would continue under ECO, and it would be in the best interest of the Scottish Government, given that they are actively trying to encourage ECO in. So that's a question really to put to the Scottish Government.
So it's not being reported at the moment, and the question is why?
Well, I don't know, because it's not reported publicly. It was an informal reporting sort of through government department in one government to the relevant departments in the Scottish Government.
The ECO reports you refer to are public, and they don't include Scottish-specific data.
I don't think it breaks it down by country, but I would hope that the informal agreement would continue under this new programme, but I don't believe it's broken down publicly at the moment.
This raises an interesting question, which we might not be able to find the answer to today. If the Scottish Government's budget to help fuel poverty is predicated on there being, what, £130 million a year coming in from energy companies, and we don't know if that money is coming in or not, from what you're saying, because the reporting doesn't give us that detail.
Not that I'm aware at the moment, okay. and it didn't publicly under CERT either. But so that's why it's particularly apt that you ask that.
I think it's an area we'll need to, as a committee, look into further. Sam Gardner, do you want to say something?
To come back to the need for reporting, and to echo all that Elizabeth said, but also to reinforce it with the need for the reporting on the assumptions that the RPP makes that what the budget will deliver by way of carbon savings on an annual basis. And I know I've made this point before to the committee, and the committee made it in its recommendations on the RPP, is that we need to strengthen the reporting and monitoring of the delivery of the programmes that are set out in the RPP. And so quarterly reporting on the rollout of measures under HEAPS and their effectiveness and their take-up would be very valuable in confirming or testing the assumptions that the RPP makes about the levels of emissions abatement we're going to achieve.
Thank you. Right, Margaret McDougall.
Thank you. Many of the questions that I was going to ask on fuel poverty have now been asked, but can I just say that the Scottish Government is required by the Housing Act to eradicate fuel poverty by 2016, if possible. So from what we've heard this morning, are you saying that that figure is, we're not going to meet that figure? And because we now have an increase in number of households who are living in fuel poverty. I think it's 900,000 households now living in fuel poverty. So are you agreeing with me that that is the fact they're unlikely, they are going to fail in meeting that target of 2016 to eradicate fuel poverty, and this budget is not going to help them in any way to reach that figure?
I'm grateful that you've pointed out that this is a statutory target. It's often mistaken as a policy aspiration, but it is actually a duty on the Scottish Government. The target for a number of years has obviously been challenging, and but it's not impossible. But with the current levels of funding, and especially with the seesawing effect that we've seen in the past few years on the fuel poverty budget, it's unlikely to be enough. But there's a, with the will, these targets can be met. But I would say that it is all making a difference. It isn't that what we're doing is not the right thing, that it's not ineffective. It's just that it is challenging to bring the housing stock up to the standard of energy efficiency that's required, to bring people on board, to win hearts and minds. But also, remember, you need to boost the income side of of the equation, that it's also, fuel poverty is also about maximising people's income, supporting through wider poverty, anti-poverty strategies. And remember too that there's a preventative spending aspect to tackling fuel poverty. For example, if you're taking someone out of a cold, damp home into a warm, dry home, then you may find that there's less to spend on certain health problems, which impacts on the health budgets. So there does need to be more put in terms of resources to meet the 2016 target. It is very challenging, but it's not impossible.
Back in, can I just get clarity on one issue? This is the statutory target, 2016. What happens if we don't meet the target? Does somebody go to prison?
You do.
If it's illegally binding target, what happens in the event the target is not met? What are the sanctions?
That remains to be seen.
Dr. Gardner, can you help?
Well, only by comparison to the Climate Change Act targets, of which we've missed 2, and to date nobody has gone to prison. There is, yeah, so if it's anything like the Climate Change Act, then the scrutiny of the Parliament, the public scrutiny of the failure is the sanction that exists in the absence of hitting the target.
Okay, sorry, I'll bring Margaret back in. Sorry for that.
Thank you for stealing my next question.
Diversion.
But, can we just go back then? I mean, this morning we've heard about the monitoring and reporting could be improved, and also that more could be done to perhaps from the private sector, given that they're going to be responsible for almost 2/3 of what's required, according to the government, to eradicate fuel poverty. So if there was one thing that you could say needs to be done for us, for the Scottish Government to meet this target, what would it be? Or is it, well, I'm sorry, I'm trying to preempt your answer, but is it purely financial resources that would make it happen?
Financial resources are always important, but there needs to be the bringing together of resources, and I mentioned earlier about the cross-cutting across departments. I think the kind of, the term usually used is silo effect. We need to look at the impact beyond, just pure energy efficiency, bricks and mortars, and come back to really what the effect is on people and meeting the aspirations of government, whichever government it is. So there is no one easy answer. We need to do more of what we're doing now, because it really does need the concerted effort to bring that together.
One of the things would surely be a better monitoring so that we don't see this underspend. And you did mention earlier that some of the applications that are required from individuals are onerous. And, why are they so onerous? And is there any way that could be made easier so that the actual application process is then speeded up?
The particular part of the programme that you refer to just now, that I might called onerous, that's actually part of the energy companies obligation, which is which stems from the UK government. But there is work that the Scottish government could do to sort of mitigate the effects of that. For example, at the moment, in order not to duplicate effort, where the energy company obligation, where say a householder is eligible for the energy company's obligation programme, then they're not eligible for the Scottish Government part. That's supposed to step in where there's a gap. What we're again having anecdotal evidence from at the moment is that, I'll give you an example. There's maybe an electric heating system that's very old and inefficient, or maybe not working at all, and that could be replaced under ECO, but no supplier is currently offering that within their mix. No fuel utility companies currently offering a new electric heating system within their mix of measures that they're offering. So technically, that householder is eligible for eco, but they're not getting the measure, and the Scottish Government part of the scheme can't step in and fill the gap as it's intended, because technically they are eligible. So there's a bit of an anomaly there that needs to be sorted out. And that's where extra expenditure, for example, could step in and help.
Thank you.
Thank you. Marco Biaggi had hopefully a brief follow-up.
Yes. In terms of the fuel poverty target, I would say there are probably three factors feeding into levels of fuel poverty: energy efficiency, energy prices, and incomes. And if you were putting those three in an order, which would you say was the biggest contributor right now to the unfortunate changes we've seen in fuel poverty?
In terms of the causes, you're right, it is all three. Most recently, energy prices rising has been on everyone's radar, really. You know, very few people are not aware now of the cost of gas and electricity. But there has been a longer term problem of us not addressing the energy efficiency of homes. And that has built up over a number of years and will therefore take a number of years through retrofitting to improve and to solve. So in terms of timescales, one's kind of more recent and one's has been building up over time.
Since basically 2008-9, which was where the increases kind of started, which has been the biggest contributor to the change, the upward change? Because since then we have had quite a considerable retrofit scheme that we didn't really have before.
Energy prices are widely recognised. Increasing energy prices are widely recognised as being the main cause to the rise in fuel poverty at the moment.
Okay, Alison Johnson.
I think I'll address this question to Sam Gardner, if I may. It's clear from your evidence that WWF Scotland see the budget process as something of a Groundhog Day. That there's been a consistently inadequate, there's consistently been inadequate support for key areas that would enable the transition to a low carbon economy. Which is clearly disappointing if we think about all the jobs that could be created, the emissions cut, the bills reduced. You state that it would be very important, it's very important that the reference to increasing sustainable economic growth be removed from the single purpose of the National Performance Framework. I'd just like you to expand on why you think that is so important. Do you believe that the budget would deliver better outcomes if the single purpose were removed, and that funding would be directed differently and in a way that might ensure we were investing enough in energy efficiency and in active travel?
There's quite a lot there, so I'll take it one step at a time. But firstly, to reflect on the reference to a Groundhog Day, which is your words, but they're kind of true. They reflect, I suspect, the committee's own reflections, annual reflections on the budget. But from looking back over parliamentary questions, it's clear that on average there's been £54 million that's been allocated to funding for what was UHIS, EAP and now HEAPS on an annual basis. And that has to be seen in the context of what I understand is Energy Action Scotland's and Fuel Poverty Forum's reference figure of 200 million, which was from a 10-year programme of an annual fund of 200 million per year from 2006 to 2016. So year on year, we have fallen well short of the benchmark as to what's been necessary. And clearly, with every year that passes, the challenge gets more and more significant. If we look at what's still needed to be done in the housing sector, we only have 42% of lofts have 200 millimetres of insulation. We still need a third of cavities insulated. And we've only seen a roughly 2% increase in solid wall insulation since 2007. So there's a big job to be done. Now, the extent to which the budget aligns with the National Performance Framework and is influenced by and shaped by its purpose is a good question. I think the evidence to date is that the budget is not aligned across the broad spectrum of indicators within the National Performance Framework. And there's a job to be done to both broaden the purpose of the National Performance Framework so it better reflects a flourishing Scotland with improved well-being for all and doesn't provide a kind of singular purpose around a measure of GDP. If we were to do that, I think that would open up the budget process and the allocation of priorities and the identification of priorities to a greater range of areas and provide strength for funding on work such as energy efficiency in our housing stock, which would go a long way to, as Elizabeth said, tackling fuel poverty, improving the health, reducing costs to the NHS, creating jobs. But first we have to, one, integrate the National Performance Framework with the budget, and I think to date we don't see that. It's the committee's identification of the National Performance Framework is very welcome, but if we do that, we also then have to broaden out its purpose, not give it that overriding pursuit of GDP, but to engage with other measures of well-being that I know many of you have engaged with in recent years. It was the Humankind Index that Oxfam have produced, an ecological footprint index that was at one point part of the National Performance Framework. At the moment, we have 2 sustainability indicators for the purpose indicators. They are, one of them's out of date in as much as it's reduced climate change emissions by 2011. You know, we've kind of moved on, and the other one is for 2050. So there's clearly a need to broaden those out to better reflect our true environmental well-being. And I think that would go an awful long way to making it, making the case for better allocation of funds to deliver for a better, more flourishing Scotland.
Okay, thank you. Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Convener. And I think, you know, we've covered quite a lot of ground at the moment as well. The one thing I'd probably like to emphasise is that the Cabinet Secretary has put forward a draft budget. And I think he's at great pains to say that it is a draft and would welcome from, you know, basically anyone how to realign this budget in ways that's going to make a difference. With the Energy Action Scotland, I think one of the things that, you know, and I think Margot Biaggi raised the point there, it's for the consumer, probably the single most thing that impacts on them and increases their poverty, not just fuel poverty, is the energy bills. And I think all consumers would accept that. With regard to the budget, I mean, how would you best align and what differences can you suggest to the Cabinet Secretary that's going to make the biggest impact? Given that it's a block grant, there isn't additional monies that he can actually, you know, supply. So we've got the block grant, you've got the budget. How would you intend to realign to meet your specific needs? Energy Action Scotland first.
Elizabeth Gore first. Do you want to try that?
In terms of the budget, you know, we do acknowledge that the proposed budget for next year is higher than originally anticipated. But I've also said that more would be helpful. But where that money is taken from really is not something that we would...
But isn't that the problem, that suggestions are always saying more would be helpful, but people aren't willing to come forward and say, we'll take it from somewhere else?
That's really a matter for the government, for business.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. And what I'm saying is that it's also helpful to the Cabinet Secretary to align his budget when people come forward with positive solutions to that as well, surely. And surely it's not the aim of the government to mitigate the constant energy hike price in some respects, you know, to mitigate the poverty aspect. The money's got to come from somewhere.
Chair, I think it's a little unfair to ask people who evidence to find other pots of resource, particularly when we put them in the position where they're firefighting.
I would suggest it's not. I'm suggesting basically we're trying to align budgets.
Can we please not have members talking over each other? I think Anzala, with respect, I think it is a fair question. I think if people are proposing spending more money in a particular area, I think it's perfectly fair to say, have they thought about where that money might come from? And I dare say if I asked Dr. Gardner that question, he would have the roads budget in mind, would he?
Had the roads budget in mind.
I took the words out of your mouth.
Capital spending, no more roads.
But I would start before flagging the roads budget and the 145 million saving from the fourth road bridge, or 150, I forget. This is, in both cases, these are statutory targets. In the fuel poverty target, the Climate Change Act target, they are, the budget should give absolute confidence that every last effort has been made to ensure that these have been hit. And when we look at a track record of funding over the last 5 years that is so significantly short of what has been advised and now what is government policy of aiming for 200 million, clearly the onus is on the government to make the case that this funding is adequate to hit those targets. And I think in the context of the RPP, which sets out clear, approximate funding levels, and then in the context of evidence that WWF has provided to previous rounds of scrutiny of the budget, which has flagged the shortfall in funding between achieving our climate change targets and what we're seeing. So analysis that we commissioned from independent consultants suggested that there was a cost of 4.6 billion to hitting a 36% reduction in our emissions by 2020, and current funding would total approximately 1.5 billion. Now, you could quibble over the size of some of those numbers, but the gap is significant. The case has to be made by the government that this gap is going to be matched by some other funding from elsewhere. We don't see evidence of that. And in that context, we are concerned that the budget, as it's brought forward, the draft budget, will not mark that step change in action that we need to see to hit either our fuel poverty targets or our climate change targets. And when you look, that emissions from the residential sector went down by, rose by 15% between 2009 and 2010, and then fell by 21% the following year, it highlights just the volatility of the emissions from our housing sector, the exposure of those homes to the vagaries of Scottish winters, and the lack of control that we have exerted over our housing stock in terms of the quality of the infrastructure and people's ability to insulate themselves from cold winters and from fuel prices. So it's WWF's recommendation that, and it's no different from what we've said in previous years, it remains consistent that the budget for energy efficiency and fuel poverty should be doubled, to approximately 135 or 140 million, and that would go a long way to giving some extra confidence that we can actually hit those targets. And yes, the transport budget is an area where we think funds could be redirected.
I thought you might say that. Jenny Hogan, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, just quickly, I'll totally back up Sam on what he's just said. And from our perspective, yes, we have our renewable heat target in particular. You already mentioned that the Audit Scotland report had highlighted that we've still got a long way to go to meet that. And indeed, this committee's own report on the targets inquiry last year said a very similar thing. So yes, that's where we would like to see resources put in to ensure that we meet the government's own target on that. And I think it also links very closely to what we've been discussing on fuel poverty already, and that we see that renewable heat does have a very important role in helping to reduce fuel poverty. So both things are very closely linked, I think.
And I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will take these views into account as it's a draft budget with his final proposals.
We'll look forward to that. Marco Biaggi, do you want to come in?
Yes. On this roads budget issue, I have to say I'm quite supportive of the idea of spending more on active travel in particular, but I'm keen to know which pot is going to get raided. I take it we're not talking about the 1.22 billion that's being spent on buses, rails or ferry in next year's budget, but you want to go after the 627.1 in motorways and trunk roads. Is that correct?
That would seem like a sensible place to start. We're talking about, at the moment, the level of funding for active travel, which is in the region of 1% of the total transport budget. If we are to have confidence that ambitions such as those set out in the Cycling Action Plan are to be met, clearly 1% is not adequate. And whilst we welcome the additional funding that the Cabinet Secretary has earmarked for cycling, it would seem like a modest step in the right direction rather than a significant leap forward down the cycle path to a more active future. We have ambitions of 5% of the budget aligned with active travel should be the immediate goal, but we need to look beyond that if we're to aspire to the levels of active travel that we see in our European counterparts. So the roads budget in particular is an area that it's modest amounts of realignment in order to deliver big changes in cycling infrastructure.
I appreciate the 1% figure, which is very good for the overall budget, but since I assume you don't want to touch the 60% of that is going into public transport, it starts to scale up. And I'm just looking which, at the level 3 figures, which of those would you want to take money out of? Would it be the PFI payments, the 85, winter maintenance 74, roads depreciation 89, structural repairs 25? Because when I get, and I've been looking at this, when I get down to what the actual figure is for new roads, I see a figure of 51. Now, you could take all of that away and still not make that 100 million 5% target. So is that what you're looking for, or are you trying to get extra money into the transport budget in practice from elsewhere?
I think the transport budget is skewed in favour of carbon-intensive infrastructure. So proposals, for instance, to dual the A9, the length of the A9, WWF would contend that there ought to...
This year's budget.
Right, okay. But there are... the balance of spend over the last 5 years or so has been for 40% increase spent on road transport. I think there is scope within the budget to realign relatively small amounts of money in the grand scheme of things, given the scale of the roads budget, to better support active travel that will deliver on climate emissions, but also on health and air quality. So I think the options are there for the Cabinet Secretary in conjunction with the Transport Minister to make those decisions and to prioritise it. So,
sorry, what was that time period? Was that 5 years?
Yes, I think it is. I can confirm and come back to you.
I think that's probably the Forth Bridge, which, while we may have disagreed with the wisdom of going ahead with it in the first place, it's that ship has sailed, if that's not the wrong metaphor to use. So in terms of the flexibility for next year, that doesn't really offer any out with the budget.
Jack, just for a second, I think we are in danger of straying into the territory of the Infrastructure Committee, so can we just be a little bit careful not to extend this exchange too much?
Well, that will be my last question.
Thank you. Dr. Gardner, do you want to respond?
Only that the budget remains, there is plenty of opportunity within the budget to increase funding for active travel and reap the rewards that it offers. And the draft, the budget should be improved to do that. And along with many others in the active travel community, Transform Scotland, Stop Climate Chaos and others, we have been calling for a doubling of that budget, which in itself sounds like an awful, doubling sounds like a big ask, but in actual fact it's a very small change in the total funds available for cycling and walking.
Okay, thank you. Now, if there are no further questions members wish to come in, I think that concludes the session. Thank you all very much. It's been a very interesting session. We've covered a lot of ground and that will be very helpful to the committee. With that, we will suspend and go into private session. Thank you.
Thank you.